Welcome to the 7th year of the Nutritionist webinars. I'm Marianne Fessenden, Educational and Academic Liaison for AMTS and your host for this series. This year we are focusing solely on emissions with an emphasis on dairy cattle and what we as nutritionists need to focus on to keep our industry viable, sustainable, and profitable whilst minimizing the effect dairy has on the environment. To this effort, our speakers this year will focus on providing information and help us get accurate information spread beyond the industry. Typically, I play music prior to the start of each webinar session. This year, we have decided to hold an open question forum 30 minutes prior to the start of the presentation. This is an opportunity to ask AMTS team members questions. You can ask questions on any topic, be it program functionality, model biology, or specific nutrition management questions. The Zoom webinar will be live on Facebook, and retention of those conversations will be able to be found on our Facebook page. Our first webinar speaker is Dr. Mike Van Amburgh of Cornell University. I have provided a more extensive biology on the recording webpage and in the YouTube video description. His talk focuses on increasing dairy sustainability through use of byproducts and offers thoughts on what facts about emissions show. The question session for each webinar is appended after the presentation. It is a long presentation and a lot of questions were asked.
Hi, everyone. This is Mike Van Amburgh. Thank you to AMTS for inviting me to this webinar, and to Marianne for getting it facilitated. All right, I'm going to get going. I got a lot of stuff here, so in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we get it done. I want to recognize my co-authors here, and please excuse me, I've got some allergies, so I'm coughing a little bit, but I'll get through this. So I'm going to talk about some progress in reducing environmental impact of dairy production and some things I think we need to think about. This is obviously an exciting area right now, exciting and frustrating at the same time. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of greenwashing. Thank God for the California carbon market in some regards, but eventually here we'll work it all out. I just want to make sure that as we go through all of this, that the people who should get credit for reducing carbon emissions get the credit, and that's the dairy producers. So Ryan Higgs, Larry Chase, Carl Zimick, Green Ketterings have all been part of this. Many others, but they're the ones who are listed on this slide for now. So my outline, right, and this is more of a dialogue. And we can ask, you guys can ask questions about this when we get to that part of the discussion today. We're making significant progress, but we have a ways to go. It changes frequently. But I'm going to share some data with you that says, hey, we're going in the right direction. There's a lot of positives. I think that's the thing that I want to get right out. There's a lot of positive things happening. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We need some science to come to our rescue, but I think it needs to relate on an emotional level. We don't do that very often. We all want to be, in this regard, we're talking about science, we're talking about, you know, how we fix problems, on the dairy, how we fix problems in the industry. It seems obvious to us, but it doesn't always attach on an emotional level. And I think that gets us into trouble. And I've got a couple examples of that. Probably won't get to them here because we just don't have time. I think the other thing we have to work through, and this is a really difficult one, we eat for nutrients. It's not a volume thing. You know, we can talk about gallons, we can talk about liters, we talk about cups, whatever. But we make milk for environment or for nutrients. And in this environmental area, this is not well described, right? And I'll give you a couple examples of that. and how I think we should all be thinking about it. We are finally moving in this direction. I see more papers coming that define it this way now, or at least discuss it. And I think that's, again, it's sciencey, but it's the only way we're gonna make progress at some level, depending upon who we're talking to. I think the next point is that everything we eat has an environmental impact. Absolutely everything. I don't care if you're growing lettuce, carrots. I'm currently in California. We're going to go visit some almond growers. We're going to look at tomatoes. We're going to look at carrots. It all has an environmental impact. So we have to know the trade-offs. We have to know what do we want to take the place of it? What do we want to replace something with? And is that as nutrient dense? And is it as nutrient dense for the environmental impact as what we started with? Milk's a good example. I'm going to give you an example of almond and dairy, because I think that's a great one and one that we face all the time as a dairy industry. We need to also understand the food system. And this is probably one of the biggest issues. This is a vexing problem for me. People who get into this space have no idea how the food system works. And it's hard to explain. Again, it's one of those things that you can't describe on an emotional level sometimes, or I struggle to find the words, but we need to be thinking about it. And that is, what do we do when we make food? We can't consume everything. There's byproducts. What do we do with them? Almond versus dairy is going to be my example. Net zero is coming. Both New York and the dairy industry have made a commitment to be not emitting carbon or be sequestering carbon by a certain period in time. We've made good progress. We have to continue to make progress. I think there's an opportunity here, but it's also politically a tough place to be. And with consumers, it's a really tough place to be, because again, they don't understand the things that I just talked about. The nutrition supply chain, I put you in there, can help. I'll give you one very simple example, because I think in the end, what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to come up with an accounting system. We are trying to account for the carbon that enters the farm and the carbon that leaves the farm. We're also trying to account for the nitrogen that enters the farm and the nitrogen that leaves the farm, and phosphorus and potassium. And I'm sure there's going to be other things. Then I mentioned the nitrogen, right, as part of this net zero, simply because the more nitrogen we excrete or we bring on as fertilizer, the greater the capacity for nitrous oxide emissions. And we have to remember the global warming potentials. If the global warming potential of methane is 28 or 34, and the global warming potential of nitrous oxide is 298, or essentially 300, 1 gram of nitrous oxide is 10 grams of methane. So we have to be careful that we understand that and focus on both. So I want the dairy industry or the nutrition industry can help there. Finally, we need to be transparent. I've got one example from China. All right. Many of you have seen this or some form of this. I think we have to start here. I'm not going to spend time on it. This is U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by gas and sector. You can see here, transportation is 29%, electricity at 28, industry at 22. Add those all up, and we're about in the 80s, right? And then there's 9% agriculture, 6% commercial, 5% residential. From my part of society, all I hear about is this, right? It's the cow, right? We happen to use the cow there because of the methane. It's the cow, right? Where is methane? It's 10% of our U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon dioxide is 82. Nitrous oxide is 6. Right? So are they high numbers? not as a percentage of the total inventory, right? CO2 is still big. One quick aside, we don't have to count CO2 production from animals because they're considered, for the most part, they're considered vegetarians. So if you feed them a plant-based diet, that carbon was sequestered during photosynthesis. It was consumed and respirated. And that's carbon that actually is just recycled. They don't count methane the same way, even though it probably came from photosynthetic sources. That's a bit of a problem to me. We can get into that later with question and answer, but I think that's, in terms of an accounting process, that's a bit of an issue, because a lot of that methane coming from acetate production, coming from fiber digestion, is going to be photosynthetic. But be that as it may, this is where we're at, right, in our partition. This is an old slide. Years ago, they did a life cycle assessment of milk. There's one really big thing here, right? Not going to spend time on it. This is from 2010. The numbers really haven't changed much. They've gotten better. I'll show you that in a minute. Here's the bottom line. 72% of dairy greenhouse gas emissions come from milk and feed. So it's farm gate. And it's really fascinating to me. It's hard to manage the farm gate. We have lots of inventories of greenhouse gas, but they're one of my biggest issues right now with how policymakers are approaching this is that they want us to reduce it. In New York, it's voluntary, yet they have this expectation. But we don't have really good farm level inventories of enteric greenhouse gas production, methane production specifically, on the average dairy in the state of New York. And I pick on New York because that's where I work and live. And that's the group that I interact with the most. And if we're going to make any change, we have to do some farm level inventories to figure out what the footprint looks like. But the largest percentage of it is at the farm gate. Jude Capper, Roger Cady, Dale Bauman published a paper in 2007 talking about the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and how that changed from 1944 to 2007. And everybody has used that data, and we're grateful for them for doing those calculations. I have fun with Dale. I say, well, that's simply just a dilution of maintenance calculation. But it was useful, right? Again, trying to make it, it's not emotional, but humanize it a little bit. But it was very high in 1944. We had a lot of cows, not so high in 2007 by comparison. Well, what's it look like in 2017? So they went back, Roger and Jude published another paper in 2020 and looked at 10 years, right? Using the same modeling approach they did for the first paper. And I think the fun thing here, and here's why I say we're making progress. This is resource use and greenhouse gas emissions from U.S. dairy production over 10 years, ending in 2017, per 1 million metric tons of saleable energy-corrected milk. Okay, so standardized. Here's the percentage. There's only one in triple digits, and that's transportation. Everything else went down. Everything went down. That's awesome news. One of my fears is that they publish this, they can see it. We can't, I'm not sure we can count this, right? If the industry said we've got to reduce by 30% by 2030 or 2050, right? Is this part of it? Because if you look at these numbers, we're doing good things, right? We're becoming more efficient. We have the same amount of cows, maybe a few less. We have definitely less herds, right? One of the outcomes of this is consolidation of the dairy, larger, theoretically more efficient dairies, making more milk. But with that happening, everything's dropped in these categories, 15 to 31%, except for transport, as I pointed out, that went up 12%. So we're making great progress. can we do this again? Is this just normal? Is this what our 10-year expectation is going to be? I don't think so, right? And this gets into the concept of intensity versus just plain methane or greenhouse gas mitigation, right? We could come in with some compound like DSM's product, Bovaer, 3NOP, that does reduce methane, right? Might be a while here in the US, but it's approved in Europe now. That's good, but it's part of it. So anyhow, but there's, I guess where I'm going there is I'm not sure that's going to happen right away here, but we can do things. What this says is we can do things with management of cows to reduce this impact, and we should keep working towards that. And I think this is really positive news. The other thing, as I said, is who's going to get credit for this and how do we keep track of it? If you look at the original comparisons, total greenhouse gas emissions, kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of milk, here's 1944, here's 2007. This is, and then they broke it out into methane. Here's 2007 versus 2017, and this is using 28 as the global warming potential for methane. IPCC raised it up to 34 on a CO2 equivalent. You see the same thing, right? That's going to raise these two values up, but you see the same decrease. So in 10 years, there have been pretty significant decreases in methane output. And we should applaud that, and we should continue it, and we should figure out how to account for it and make sure that people know it, especially our processors and policymakers. And then figure out what we did, what were the root causes of that. And that's laid out in some of this paper. I can't get into it right now, but I would encourage everybody to go read the paper or ask me for a copy. I'll send you one. The farm footprint here is really important. Green Kettering's as part of our nutrient management sphere program at Cornell has been doing these whole farm nutrient mass balances for years, right? In very simple terms, she's looking at imports of feed, fertilizer, animal bedding, and manure. She's looking at how those nutrients are distributed around the farm. She's looking at exports of milk and animals, crops, manure, and anything else that we might export off the dairy. And she's looking at the balances. Most of us have this data available, and it wouldn't be that hard to do this, except it takes time to do the accounting. Again, this is one big accounting exercise. And then what she's been able to do is look at it per tillable acre or per hundredweight of milk, right? So we're looking at land base for nutrient cycling or milk nutrient use efficiency. And I think this has been really useful. And from this, she's come up with some what she calls adaptive management criteria. And this isn't so much about CO2 and greenhouse gases as it is on the nitrogen phosphorus side. But as I said earlier, paying attention to nitrogen is important because as we reduce that, we reduce nitrous oxide, and that has much more of an impact than methane. It's not on everybody's radar, but I can tell you that we're grossly overfeeding protein in many situations in the dairy industry yet. Right, so she's come up with these feasible mass balances. I just realized I have my metric slide up here, but you guys can do the math. You can have these slides. So these feasible mass balances should allow farms to be economically viable and environmentally sustainable. Right? She's got the three big ones here: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And she has them listed in kilograms per hectare, so pounds per acre, or kilograms per 45 kilograms of milk, which means pounds per hundredweight. Just have to divide or multiply by 2.204 to get these in pounds. But you can see the range here. and then do your math on hectares, which is 2.5 hectares per acre. So 0 to 119 on milk for on land for nitrogen, or 0 to 0.4 kilograms per 45 kilograms of milk. So obviously going below 0 is not going to be feasible, but going too high is going to create losses and be consistent with overfeeding. Phosphorus, the same way. Phosphorus to me is an interesting story, especially in the Northeast. The dairy NRC, or NASEM as it's called now, came up with pretty good phosphorus recommendations back in 2001. And to his credit, Larry Chase went out and, at least in New York, taught our industry how to do that, how to meet those requirements. And New York looks really good on phosphorus balance now. Much better on phosphorus balance than we do on nitrogen. And then potassium has the same range. Again, you don't want to mine this stuff, but you don't want to overuse it. But these mass balances are useful because it gives us a framework for understanding where a dairy's at and how we can make change and where we need to make change to get all of this under control. And she's done that and created these kind of, this looks blue here, but it's supposed to be a green box of where should you be and where's a good place to be in the feasible mass balance. So here she has phosphorus balance in pounds of P per acre. And here's milk production per acre, right? 1,000 pounds per acre and pounds of P per acre. And she's got different years here. Here's 2005 to 2007 and 2017 to 2019. And the early years are diamonds and the current, more contemporary years are circles. And if you were to look at this graph, the majority, except for one, the majority of the dots up here on phosphorus are from, not quite 10 years ago. If you look at this now, those same herds, or similar herds, are down in this feasible balance range. And so what we're saying is, if you want to reduce your environmental impact, you want to get your dairy into this green box region here. And you can see, there's here's 2005 or 2005, here's 2017 to 2019. So you can see how things have shifted, where we were, where we're at. Looks really good in the state of New York. And you can look at the balances over here. You can look at the animal densities, they've gone up. Milk production, as you would expect, has gone up. Milk per acre has increased about 5,000 pounds per year. P balance has gone down on an acre basis and on a per hundredweight basis. Crop yields have gone up slightly. Fertilizer imports have gone down. Feed imports have come up, right? In pounds of P per acre, feed imports have come up about 6 pounds of P per acre. Feed has gone down a little bit. P contents remain the same. And again, this goes back to the 2001 NRC, and again, I give credit to Larry Chase. So some of this is just getting everything in balance and understanding where it goes, right? You look at nitrogen. Nitrogen is better. Here's nitrogen balance in pounds of nitrogen per acre. Here's milk production in 1,000 pounds per acre. We're coming down, right? Here's your diamonds, so the previous years, circles are the current years. This is a good slide. The data here, if you look at the largest part of the data set that Karine still has, we're out here on nitrogen, right? So we're way above this feasible balance. This is a politically correct slide, but my words. But you can see the fertilizer imports, what they've done. They've gone up significantly. Feed imports have gone up significantly. Feed tons per animal unit have gone down a little bit, which means we're using more homegrown feed. P content of the diet, or sorry, crude protein content of the diet went down 15.6 to 15.2. So we're creeping down there, for the dairies that she's got information on. But we need to do better on this nitrogen side. And if you could see some of the other data that are out there, There's a lot of herds up here yet. We're grossly overfeeding nitrogen, or we're putting on too much fertilizer, or we're not making good use of our manure as fertilizer. Okay. So, she came up with these kind of statements. Farms that maintain a 3-year running average at or below 119 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare meet the adaptive management guidelines, and really they're doing about as good as they can, right? You can do that. Phosphorus at 13.6 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare and maintain all of these other characteristics, you're doing really well. And a lot of New York State is there, right? So this is possible. The key to the whole thing is you have to measure the data, and you have to do the mass balance. I'm a big advocate of this. I think this is a great first step for any dairy anywhere in the world. It's not easy at first, but once you get your information consolidated, it really doesn't take time to figure this out. And I would encourage people to do this, because I think this is how we're going to move the system ahead. Okay. On the nitrogen side, what do we do? And again, I'm going to have to move fast through this. Many of you have seen this. We published it in 2015 as part of the model update. I always show this simply because I think we get caught up in this idea of nitrogen efficiency. And I think nitrogen efficiency is a bit misleading. There's some thinking out there that says if we get the amino acid balance of the cow perfect, the efficiency of the use of nitrogen in that cow is going to go up significantly, and we're not going to have to feed as much. And there's a little bit of truth to that, but not that much. Most of this nitrogen efficiency, the way we've been trying to do it, is really driven by energy. And I was trying to work at that in this analysis. And this is total collection studies taken from our own research and some from the literature, Wisconsin and Penn State specifically, where they did really good total collection studies. So this is where energy is first limiting. In a lot of dairies, we can't go in and throw a whole lot more energy at cows and expect more milk production. And all of that would drive, productivity. But we can go in and say, what is their milk production, and do I need to feed that much nitrogen to meet those requirements? And maybe the form of the nitrogen can change, right? That's not today's talk, but this kind of gets at that. So we've got cows making 88 to 90 pounds of milk, consuming about 54 pounds of dry matter intake, with crude protein that ranges from 14 to almost 19%. And we have milk, urine, and fecal nitrogen excretion here in grams per day, and then nitrogen intake. So this crude protein converted to nitrogen. This milk nitrogen is milk total protein. So true milk protein converted to a nitrogen basis. So it's not milk, urea, nitrogen. This is milk protein converted to a nitrogen basis, so everything can be on the same graph. Here's fecal nitrogen, here's urinary nitrogen. Real quick, there's some really interesting things here. To me, this is what we can do. This is our first task as a nutritionist, to get towards some sort of an adaptive management process in a cow. If you look at where most cows are at, they're here. They're excreting more urinary and fecal nitrogen than they're putting out in the milk, right? This is about 660 grams of nitrogen. If you look at this next step, notice, first of all, what do you see here? There's no change in milk nitrogen output. There's really no change in fecal nitrogen output. All of our variations here in urine. And what this clearly says in all of these studies is that to get cows to produce and yield, 88 to 90 pounds of milk, we really only need about 14% crude protein if we get the profile and the amino acids correct. Once you get below that, it does start to fall off, and we have data now But for the most part, we can operate here at, about 540 grams of nitrogen intake when in fact, we're feeding way up in the 700s, right? And all this is telling us is that she doesn't need it and she's going to pee it away. And that's what you see here, right? She's going to excrete it in the urine. So we want to go from this, where we're excreting more nitrogen in the urine to at least being 1-to-1 with milk nitrogen, right? And if you think about that, we're going down here, we're decreasing 40 to 50 grams of nitrogen a day, which ends up being, depending on which kind of soybean meal you purchase and use in your dairy, at least roughly a pound and a half of soybean meal equivalent. And so in simple terms, moving from here to here is removing about 1.5 pounds of soybean meal. And this then puts us in a 1-to-1 relationship between urine and milk. Now, we're going to move this to productive N and not just milk because we've got to worry about maintenance and pregnancy and tissue and things like that. But if we're really doing well, we've got great forages and good control in the animals, we can be down here at 1.1 or 1.2-to-1 milk to urine. Right? In doing this, now we've come down into the range of about 570, 580, right, from being up here at about 610. So we've made a big change. Now we're talking over 2 pounds of soybean meal equivalent that we don't need. It causes us to do a better job of meeting the ruminal requirements and then refining how we meet the post-ruminal requirements for amino acids. But it is possible to do this, and you're not going to get more milk protein, but you're not going to lose anything either, right? And now we're financially and environmentally more efficient. So this is basically Korean Kettering's adaptive management for dairy cow. We're just focused on urine here and only on nitrogen. Right. We've had these metrics for a while. If you can look at it on a productive end, this is tissue, reproduction, pregnancy, milk, and maintenance. So productive end, the urinary end, the average ratio is about 0.7-to-1. If you can get it to 1-to-1, you've saved quite a bit for the environment. And you've also probably made the diet more cost effective, although right now with feed prices the way they are, who knows which way that's going to go. But if you can get it to 1.25-to-1, now you're doing great things and you're really making the cow efficient and you're reducing the environmental impact significantly, right? And a couple examples here, this particular example I pulled, this herd was at 1.46-to-1, right? Really, really good. And it just happens to be the highest herd that I was aware of because we were trying to understand the herd and how they were doing it. Here's another one that I pulled. I think this is from a European herd, actually, 1.26-to-1, right? Productive end, so nitrogen efficiency, 34%, which is good, not great. Right? And I think that's part of this where we talk about how efficient can we use nitrogen. We really didn't change milk production, so the efficiency didn't change, but you can change this, because you can get rid of the nitrogen that she's not making use of and do a better job formulating for things that both the rumen require and then post-ruminal amino acids. Okay. Switch gears one more time. There's lots of topics here, right? If we're going to do this environmental thing, we got to cover a lot of ground. Larry Chase in New York State led this effort for years and had a national presence in this area on precision feeding, precision feed management. This is from 2011. This is dairy herd management, talking about feed costs, feed efficiency, and the environment. We're still doing the same thing, and we always will, right? I don't like this term to a degree because it implies that we've been imprecise in everything else that we've done, and I don't believe that to be true. We might have been too casual about some of it, but we weren't imprecise. So why precision feed management? improve farm profitability, improve efficiency of nutrient use, decrease, nutrient excretion in the environment, comply with environmental regulations. New York's been after dairy industry to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus for years. I just talked about that. Methane is no longer on the short list. Methane is currently front and center. Again, they're not mandating it in New York, or they say it's voluntary, but there's a pretty big expectation. Okay, so we'll get there. There's a project that Larry Chase led. It was 3 years, had herds in several counties. These are not big herds for the most part. They used NRCS, Proficient Feed Management Guidelines and the NRCS 592 Feed Management Standards. There was a lot of people involved here. I won't get into all the details. They like, most of this, you got to conduct a lot of herd visits. You got to take samples and do analysis. You've got to measure things in the cows, body weight and body condition score, milk yield, milk components, all of that. And then they ran everything through the CNCPS. Not that that's, but, running it through the CNCPS gave us a chance to actually do, again, it's the accounting principle here that allows us to help account for that stuff and actually help affect change, right? Because as we've improved the CNCPS, it allowed us to partition nitrogen better between rumen and post-ruminal, and you'll see what that means here. Not all these cows were fed through the CNCPS, but they were evaluated through the CNCPS. Right, so if you look at 8 herds here, in this study, and you look at their starting milk, some of these were not high producing cows. We're in that 55-pound range, all the way up into, the 88 to 90-pound averages here, right? So there's quite a range in dairies. There's a range in size. If you look at the final milk, aside from this herd here that was a fairly small herd, notice that for the most part, there's a 5 kilo, so there's a 10 to 12 pound increase. Stayed the same. There's a 3 kilo increase, so we're talking about 7 to 8 pounds. Stayed the same. Went up about a kilo, went up a few kilos, right? So through this project, everybody, for the most part, was able to maintain their milk or increase their milk. On average, it was an increase. Milk fat, up and down, but again, more ups than downs, although there's a couple downs here, but that's okay. As milk volume goes up, maybe you're going to make a little less fat, a little dilution effect. If you looked at milk true protein, held constant or went up a little bit, right? So all good. Bottom line here, go in, do this precision feeding management, work to remove the nitrogen and the phosphorus, make the diets more efficient, reduce environmental impact, and we're doing good things on the herd management side for the most part, right? Profitability is looking pretty good, which I'll show in a minute. If you just look at the nitrogen, right, and these were all predicted manure nitrogen excretions, the model has good equations for that. That's all published. Here's what I think is really interesting. These herds were ranging anywhere from 16 to 20.5% crude protein. And this was not that long ago, folks. And at the end of the process, we're down 14.9 to 16.5, right? A big decrease in crude protein, initial manure nitrogen excretion in grams per cow per day, and final, where are we at? And percentages. We're down anywhere from 5% to 29%, right? When you put that in kilograms of nitrogen, small herd, not much, 383, larger herd, 16,000 kilograms. So over 16 tons on a metric basis of nitrogen. That's a lot. But even some of these herds, that's a lot of nitrogen that didn't go into the environment. More importantly, it's a bunch of nitrogen that you didn't pay for. Right now, that could be worth a lot. So when we look at profitability, I think this is also good. When you look at milk income, there it is. But I want to look at this right down here. Income over total feed costs. What changed? This is in dollars per cow per year. 62, no change here, 168, 299, 18, all positive, except for one herd. When you look at income over purchase feed costs, all positive, right? And in some large, $361 income over purchase feed costs. Wow, 277. Those are big numbers, right? If you know anything about, the profitability of a dairy or the net farm income on a per cow basis, there's years where we struggle to be $100 to $200. This past couple of years, we're in quite a range. Some losing, some in the thousands. This is a significant number, right? In terms of whether you might stay in business or not. And that's an interesting thing if you really step back and think about that part. So this precision feed management can have not only a big environmental impact, but it can have a big financial impact. So I wanted to bring this to your attention because we get talking about greenhouse gas a lot, but the nitrogen and phosphorus side of this is very, very important. And the nitrous oxide is on the back side of this type of stuff here, these calculations, because we don't want to overfeed nitrogen, and we've had a propensity to do that. So I wanted to bring this to your attention. Why do we do that? I put this in here for my students, but we have this thing, I kiddingly refer to it as a safety factor, right? I could balance the diet, as I showed you guys, we can balance the diet for 15% crude protein for the level of production that was observed in most of those herds, right? 88 pounds of milk, 54 pounds intake. But as a nutritionist, I don't think you've got your act together. You don't measure dry matters all the time. There's some mixing errors every once in a while. We get the cows moved around, and I always know how many cows are in a pen. I don't want to lose you as a customer. I don't want you to lose milk. I don't want you mad at me for something. So I'm gonna increase the protein just a little bit to make sure that your cows never become nitrogen deficient. That means instead of formulating at 15, I'm going to formulate at 15.5. Right. Well, by the time you take something out, put something in, we're going to take something out, maybe forage or corn, and we're going to put soybean meal in. At the time I did this calculation, it was 22 cents a cow a day, or $40,000 a year. Right. Or 1.8 metric tons of excess nitrogen. So to me, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to sit down with the dairy producer and say, I can do this for you if we can get the variation under control. And on an environment basis, it's worth a couple tons of nitrogen. And it's probably worth, part of a feeder or part of a herd manager, right? Or a nice vacation or retirement money, however you want to couch it. And it changes the discussion, but I think it's something that's necessary, again, as we move, I'll use Kareen's terms, towards a more adaptive management process on the dairy cow side. Okay, so the safety factor. There's lots of reasons why we do that, right? Just variability, right? In the interest of time, I'm just going to keep going. In the end, we say we don't really have time to figure all this out, so I'm just going to add some more and keep moving because it's expedient. The food system, right? We'll switch gears now and talk about the food system. The general population has no idea what we feed a cow. This is a really old slide. This really struck home to me 10 years ago when there was a drought in the Midwest and they were running out of forage. And I was involved with some herds. I was getting calls from nutritionists saying, Mike, I don't have enough forage. I'm going to have to go to 20% forage or 30% forage. How do I keep these cows and ruminants happy and not crash everything, right? So I was involved in this, but at the same time, my phone was ringing with people from the news, from Cornell Press, and then things like this hit the news, and this is a Huffington Post piece. Cows fed candy instead of corn on Kentucky ranch affected by drought, right? And I remember when this came out, and Cornell Communications called and said, "Hey, Mike, we want you to do an interview and write a short piece about this cows eating candy and all these other things. Isn't this cool? You know, don't you want to talk about that?" I'm like, yeah, it's cool, but that's not new and novel. Well, what do you mean that's not new and novel? Well, cows have been doing this forever. What do you mean they've been doing this forever? It's crazy, the discussions. And I can't tell you how many people I had conversations with. I did interviews with CBS, with Slate Magazine, with NPR. I talked a lot to people. Once they hear the truth, it's not very exciting, not very sexy, never really gets out. But the bottom line is that the society does not understand the role that animal agriculture plays in utilizing the byproducts from the human food chain. And again, when you're out talking to people, and again, it's got to hit them on an emotional level. When you're out talking to people, you got to figure out how to communicate some of this. And I'll come back to that here in a little bit. This was one of those such things, right? That's a gummy bear. It's a blown up gummy bear. I spent a significant number of hours with a Ph.D. level human nutritionist. Very smart person. Very smart person. Great conversations, shared papers, shared discussion, went quiet. It was really frustrating. I found out about it because a former student who was sitting in a physician's office sent me this. So this is a piece of paper. This is out of a magazine. You can see one of the folds here, one of the folds here. Can't remember who sent it to me, but they were in the physician's office paging through, saw this, happened to see my name down here. So I had spent a lot of time with a PhD level human nutritionist explaining to them that if we are feeding all of that stuff to cows, that it's healthy for the cows as long as we do it right, and it's healthy for humans. She was adamant that that wasn't going to be true. So I explained rumen fermentation to her. I explained how we use sugars in diets. I explained how there were sugars in plants. I did everything. I tried to humanize it as much as possible. She was a PhD. I thought maybe she would connect the dots on the science. And this is what came out of it. Was this your dinner's dinner? Farmers are giving cattle stuff like stale candy and cookies instead of pricey feed. So if you're avoiding your junk, your beef probably isn't. The sweets don't alter the food's nutritional value or even hurt the animal's health, but still, ... Source, Mike Van Amburgh, Cornell professor. What really, that part was okay. Here's the thing that really torqued me off. It says, eat like a cow. They chow down on 50 plus pounds of food a day. That's like 7,250 gummies, right? So they left the reader with the idea, if somebody actually read it, they left the reader with the idea that we may feed cows nothing but gummy bears, right? Which we know isn't true, right? Because the rumen bacteria wouldn't like that. The cow wouldn't like that. We'd have a lot of acidosis and problems, but they probably just wouldn't do it. Bottom line is that even when we work really hard to communicate, it doesn't always go well. My take home is we have to be persistent. We have to learn from that experience, and we have to find different ways to do it. There's lots of byproducts out there. This group doesn't need this slide. There's a lot of things out there that we feed to a cow that comes from the human food chain. And again, figuring out a way to communicate that effectively to everyone is really, really important. And I'm going to dig into this some more as we go. So over 10 years ago, I had some enterprising students interested in this environmental impact of dairy. And there was a lot of talk, Livestock's Long Shadow came out, that UN report from 2006, authored by Henning Steinfeld, great guy. That first report wasn't right. It got a lot of traction. The math wasn't good. They used sub-Saharan Africa as the metric. Lots of stories there. Bottom line is that also motivated me to say, can we get our tools to predict this? Because I hadn't really thought about CO2 and methane emissions from cows until Livestock's Long Shadow came out. And it was one of those things that gave me pause. I read pretty much all 480 pages of it several times. And luckily some people took issue with the math. And they even published a retraction, or not a retraction, they updated it, but that never got the attention of the press. But we did modify the CNCPS, right, to account for what we feed and what the greenhouse gas emissions might be. And we got the help of the industry here. We put a call out to a bunch of nutritionists. We got 91 diets from basically Vermont and New Hampshire to Texas and California. There were 10 or 12 states represented here, all good dairy states, all from across the country. So we used that information, and then we took our predictions and compared them to what was in the literature, right? So we wanted to make sure the model was good at predicting CO2, and in fact, it does a pretty good job here. This box and whisker plot says that they're not different. This is on CO2. You look on methane, again, our box and whisker plot is not significantly different. We're predicting a little higher methane than most of the studies by about 20 to 30 grams per day. That's really not much. And we're pretty comfortable with this now, as Larry Chase has done lots and lots of comparisons, and he tells me for the most part every time he runs the comparisons, we're pretty much spot on with what somebody else measured. Right, so that gives us some satisfaction and comfort that these numbers can be used to do inventories and make decisions from. You know, and like all things, cows, like all mammals, if you're going to do more work, you're going to respirate more. And that's what this slide says, you know, predicted CO2 emissions versus milk yield. So as a cow produces more milk, we're going to push out more CO2. But it's not the CO2 in an absolute amount that's important. It's the intensity of that. And I think this is where we're driving the industry. You know, we want to reduce the CO2 emissions per unit of milk produced. So here's kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of milk and milk yield. And you can see there's this really nice inverse relationship. Again, the concept of dilution of maintenance. You know, there's some pasture cows up here, and here's our really intensively managed cows. And this is not to pick issue or take issue with pasture managed cows. They just can't make as much milk, right, as some of the more intensively fed cows. It's just what it's going to be, right? So we can have pasture cows make more milk once we figure out a few more things about what's first limiting, but they're never going to approach what we feed, what we see in well-balanced TMR fed cows. Right. Bottom line here is we want less intensity per unit of milk, and this is how we're going to get it here, and that's by just, you know, productivity is the solution. Methane is the same way as methane, you know, this is methane, not per kilogram of milk, which is straight methane. Sorry, I've got the wrong metric there on the slide. So this is methane production increasing as milk production goes up. But then if you look at it on a intensity basis, here's kilograms of methane per kilogram of milk and milk yield. You see the inverse there one more time. Again, pasture-fed cows, more intensively fed cows. So again, productivity is the solution here. You need to make more milk per unit of methane output. And that's really all this is saying. But it also says we can predict this pretty well. One caveat here, we currently have the CO2 predictions in the model. We're going to remove them. The IPCC, again, as I said earlier, counts CO2 as a neutral gas because The cows viewed as vegetarians. They really don't care about the CO2 production. What they do care about, though, is the methane. So that will stay and will be described both on a methane basis and on a CO2 equivalent basis as it has been, but it will become more of a standalone calculation because they don't, again, IPCC isn't worried about CO2. But bottom line is we can predict all this stuff. And then all those diets that I told you we got from around the country, right? What we were really interested in is how many byproducts are in those diets. You know, what's the impact of feeding those byproducts? So back to, you know, all that discussion about the candy and the gummy bears and everything else. Well, in those diets that we got received from around the country, what we did is we looked at CO2 and methane emissions, the predictions from the CNCPS as CO2 equivalents as a function of the byproduct disposal when either fed to the cows or when incinerated. At the time we made this calculation, some of the math had not been done correctly or well. And if you landfilled some of that material, how would the carbon move? And so it was easier just to, or even coming out of a biogas unit, right, if you wanted to do that. So we came up with a very discrete way of doing this, and that is just to incinerate it, right? So it's very direct. So, you know, in all of those diets, again, 91 diets from 10 different states, 31% of the diet rations were byproducts with a range of 13 to 57. And again, this includes Texas, California, Georgia, Vermont, New York, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Maine, or Michigan, Minnesota, Idaho. You know, pretty good number, 31%. Is this number real? Some work was just done, funded through DMI. Dr. Juan Tricarico and Mary Beth D'Andorza published a paper looking at byproduct use in the US, and in fact, they came up with pretty much the same number. So that's good. We can replicate this. CO2 from byproducts, these are CO2 equivalents, 4.5. Methane from byproducts on a CO2 equivalent, 4.6. Total greenhouse gas release from digestion, 9. CO2 from incineration, 46. How's that? 9 versus 46. Where'd the rest of the carbon go? Well, it went into milk and meat, right? And I think this is, so there's two things here. The first thing is that cows are the ultimate recyclers or upcyclers. At least 31% of what a cow eats across the country every day is a byproduct of the human food chain. They should be getting credit for this, right? They're being penalized for this. This is part of their methane output. And everything, and the system is saying, you know, the society is saying, well, this is bad. Cows are bad. They emit methane. We've got to stop that. Well, that's true. What they fail to recognize is that some of that methane production is actually coming from the waste product from all the other things that we're eating, right? And here's a moral dilemma for me, a little bit of a moral dilemma, but it's really just a big accounting exercise. Is how do we deal with that, right? Because we could incinerate it, we could put it in a landfill, we could put it in a biogas unit, although we don't have enough of those right now to do all of that because it's a lot of byproducts, right? If you look at the White and Hall paper from 2017, I believe, it would fill, if we took all the byproducts and put them in a landfill, it would fill our landfills 1/3 faster. So every 3 years, we would have to find more landfill space. So it's a big impact, right? And cows take the hit. And I don't think that's appropriate. how do we have, again, this is one of those things where how do we have this conversation? And I'm gonna give you some other information, a way to think about this. I don't have a good answer. I think this is really one of those dilemmas that but again, it's communication, it's policy, it's food system, it's understanding the food system, right? I think that's a big deal. We can break it out on a dry matter intake basis, on a byproduct basis, on a milk yield basis. It doesn't really matter how you want to do it, but we can do this with the model now. We can give you mins and maxes. If you want to do it repetitively and build databases, we started doing this. So we can account for this. The question is what are we going to do with it when we do? I've showed this to policymakers. They go, wow, that's really cool. And they walk out the door and I never hear from them again. I think that's one of the problems, is when they're presented with real data, they have no idea what to do. If you looked at the top 5 byproducts from this study that we conducted, 37% of the diets had corn gluten feed in it, 48% at the time had ethanol distillers, 63 had soybean meal. Yes, soybean meal is a byproduct. Sometimes I think we forget that. Whole cottonseed, 69%, canola meal, 66%. Right? Here's the average inclusion. That's a percent of the diet. Here's how much was fed per day of some of this. And there's the greenhouse gas emissions from that, broken out. So we have the capacity to do some of this. It begs the question, should the cow be penalized for this, or should they be credited for this? And I think this gets into the whole thing about what does carbon neutral mean and who's capturing the carbon, right? If the producer of the soybean meal sends it to a cow, does that make them more carbon neutral? And then we take the hit because the cow was the end unit for disposal? Well, that's not fair. So this is one of those things where we have to start making decisions about how we do this accounting and who gets credit and where the boundaries are, right? This boundary thing is very difficult. And some people have called that to my attention here lately as I talk about this. We're still not sure how to have the conversation. Here's one of those boundary items, but this one's going to bring us, I got to keep going because I'm running out of time. Here's one of those boundary issues. We're in California. I'm in California right now. I've got a group of students. We're going to go tour a bunch of almond farms and nut producers of nuts, pistachios, walnuts, almonds. If you don't know anything about an almond, this is pretty important. Roughly 80% of the almonds in the world are grown in California. It's a very water-intensive crop. You're going to see that here. I got to move a little quickly here. If you don't know, the almond, it's kind of like a peach, if you want to use that analogy. There's the fruit of the peach, which we eat. That would actually be the hull. So the hull of an almond is the pectinaceous, cellulosic part of that is highly digestible and soft and encompasses the shell, and the shell then encompasses the kernel. Why am I showing you this? This is the publication from the California Almond Board. I think from 2018. They've got their production here. You can see how it keeps increasing. They talk about their jobs, how many $1 billion to the state's GDP. It's huge. Here's what I want you to see. If you harvest 2.26 billion pounds of almonds, right, and that was their harvest in 2017, 2018, you get also as a byproduct 1.6 billion pounds of shells and 4.5 billion pounds of hulls. So it's essentially 2 to 1 on almonds to hulls. The Almond Board is very afraid of the loss or for the loss of the dairy and the animal agriculture industries in the state of California and adjoining states. Why is that? Mostly in California because it's hard to ship this stuff with fuel prices like it is. Where do you get rid of all those hulls? Think about it, 4.5 billion pounds of hulls for all the almonds, 2 times the amount of almonds that are exported around the world. You got to feed them to a cow. Well, isn't that ironic? Think about it for a minute. What's one of our major competitors in the marketplace? It's almond beverage. I don't know if it's a major competitor, but it's a strong upstart. Well, bottom line is, you'll hear me say this a couple times, they couldn't do that if we didn't have a viable dairy industry, because there'd be no place to dispose of all those hulls. I did some quick calculations one day. Somebody said, well, how much do they eat? I said, well, if you just averaged it out, there's 1.8 million dairy cattle in California. There's 5.2 million beef cattle in California. Yeah, I'm sure that everybody knows that, but there's a lot of beef cattle in California. If you assume 70% of them consume hulls, and I think it's more than that now, that's 7 million cattle. That's 648 pounds of hull per cow. It's about 1.8 pounds a day, right? So if these hulls were distributed, around 70% of all of these cows, it'd be about 1.8 pounds per day. I know because of the drought that's out here and the heavy pressure on alfalfa, that there are dairies feeding 10 to 12 pounds of hulls per day right now, and the price has gone up tremendously. If you like your almond beverage, you got to thank a cow for making it affordable and possible, because without cows consuming all of those hulls, they wouldn't know where to get rid of the byproduct, right? And that would raise the price of the almonds, because they make a bunch of money off those hulls, right? Just like soybean meal. We crush them for oil. We sell the oil at an affordable price for us to purchase to cook with, because the soybean meal has a value, right? It's that second generation thing. So I'm going to come back to this. I'm really pushing my time here. How can the supply chain help? I made mention of this early on. Well, I borrowed this from some ideas I got in Europe. I was over there for a meeting, and some colleagues were talking to me about what goes on in the Netherlands. And there's a tremendous amount of pressure in the Netherlands right now to reduce animal agriculture and the environmental impact. And I'm empathetic there for them, because it's pretty extreme. One of the things they do is their nutrition companies keep track of what they sell. You can take a ton of soybean meal, and with pretty simple chemistry today, you can convert that ton of soybean meal to a carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium basis. And you can keep track of that. So if you sell somebody 1,000 tons of soybean meal, you could send them a note saying, hey, you purchased, X, Y, Z, and A tons of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. I think this is an interesting idea. It would be a way to change the dialogue. It would be a great way to get started on some more discrete accounting methods, and helps in at least 2 other ways. Provides documents about the tons of nutrients coming onto the farm. Also creates an opportunity to understand how efficient those nutrients were used. How did I actually feed that many tons of nitrogen or phosphorus? Where did it end up? Do I have shrink? Right? We can calculate shrink now if we have to, but I think it's important that we think of new ways to do this, and this is one way that I think it could be done. Real quick, I'm going to go fast through this because I'm over my hour now. This has since changed, folks. This is January of 2020, and Starbucks basically said milk is a big environmental impact, has a big environmental impact. We want to reduce our environmental impact. We sell a lot of milk, right? They sell more milk than they do coffee, actually, in their beverages. So they want to do better, right? They did. They have since capitulated on this. They are going to, I think that's the word I wanted. They are embracing dairy again. Here in the last 6 months, they have recommitted to dairy, but they've recommitted to dairy with a whole lot of conditions. We have to get better. But when they moved away from dairy, all right, at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, they did it saying they were going to use a more environmentally friendly beverage, and that was almonds and almond milk. So Starbucks may phase out dairy to combat climate change, right? And they started putting out all these metrics about how much manure is produced, how much water they use. Their math is not quite right on the water. It's like they're counting rainwater. The manure is right. We know how much manure a cow makes. They were working with the World Wildlife Fund, and they went through and they calculated how much water the cow would consume, 124 to 145 liters of water. They talked about what it would cost to grow crops. And it was basically 3.8 liters of this 420 liters to 3.8 liters of milk, so 107 to 1. I think they're counting rainwater. I think what this ignores is the byproducts and the upcycling of nutrients and the associated water, right? This is back to the almond hulls. They're not accounting for that. The only reason they could say that they could do this, you could beat up a cow here with this kind of information, say cows are very water intensive. I want you to see something here. I'm going to do real quick. I'm going to move fast through this. They're talking about all the water necessary to make this milk, ignoring that the byproduct of almonds has to go into the system. Okay. Has to go into the food system somewhere and gets consumed by a cow. The other thing that gets missed here, right, is the nutrient requirement side of this, right? So I'm going to bring this together, right? So I'm talking about, Starbucks beating up the dairy industry and saying we're going to go to almonds. Well, so I'm going to weave in here one other thing, do it fast. So there's the whole water thing. Bear with me. I'm going to bring that to fruition. There's also the nutrient side of this, right? We buy beverages at Starbucks as beverages, but the scientist in me, when I get a latte, I'm thinking about the nutrients in the milk, right? And I'm counting the calories and I'm thinking about the phosphorus, right? So that's me, the scientist. We can, but some consumers are doing that. And I think we have to help people think through that some more too, right? Back to, we're doing this to supply nutrients, not just as a refreshing beverage. What does this slide have to do with that? Many years ago in Sweden, they were going to ban cow's milk in schools because of the environmental impact of dairy, right? This was the fallout from the Livestock's Long Shadow report from the UN that I mentioned. And they said, we're going to go to a non-dairy alternative. And at the time, the only thing out there was soy drink and oat drink. Some enterprising, and lots of these comparisons have been done now. Some people will say this paper is not right. Some people will say other papers aren't right. Everybody wants to take sides. I don't really care who's right and wrong, but I think this approach is very useful. So this is beverages vary in nutrient density and greenhouse gas emissions. So what this group did is they looked at the nutrient density of beverages in relation to climate impact. So there's milk. And what they did is that they looked at the Nordic nutrient recommendations for kids. And they said, what percent of the Nordic nutrient requirements in 100 grams of product could be met by all of these things? I know we're not going to feed beer to kids or red wine, but they did it, I think, just to be provocative. So they looked at the percent, then they looked at the nutrient density, based on some of these metrics, and then they looked at the greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 equivalents per gram of product. Right? Milk, 126%. So a 100-gram serving of this meets 126% of these humans' nutrient requirements. It has a very high nutrient density. I think the only thing that comes close to it is orange juice. Here are the greenhouse gas impacts. Milk is pretty high. Soy drink, right? Soy drink is got a pretty decent number because of all the protein in it. But once you get past the protein, there's no minerals and vitamins and things like that. There's nutrient density. Oat drink doesn't cut it. Red wine definitely doesn't cut it. Boy, a big greenhouse gas impact. Soda, water, yeah, soda, big greenhouse gas impact. Beer, not a lot of nutrients, big greenhouse gas impact. I'm not going to stop drinking red wine or beer because of this. But if I am feeding human beings and I'm thinking about meeting their requirements, I want to make sure that I focus on that, and milk looks really good. And if you think about it on the nutrient density, milk looks really good. So what can you do with this information? You can create an index. You can look at the nutrient density versus greenhouse gas emissions, right? So nutrient density as a climate impact index. And look where milk is at. We look really good. Orange, not so much. Okay, as part of it. Soy, yeah, for the protein. Oat, not really. Red wine, and the rest of it, you can see. Bottom line is that when you start to think about things this way, and you think about what we're trying to accomplish with food, and we do this with everything else, right? I'm not excusing everybody else. I'm not saying we're the best, because we're not, but we look pretty good on a nutrient basis. And I think somehow we have to figure out a way to humanize this conversation and get it out there and talk about it, because this is really what we do. This is why we make milk. Here's a life cycle assessment. I'm over. Marianne, you can truncate this if you want to. Anytime now would be good if you want to do it. Otherwise, I'll get through this. 2 engineers from the University of Wisconsin-Madison did a life cycle assessment of milk and plant-based alternatives. Published in Environmental Engineering Science in 2018. They looked at the global warming potential of dairy beverages, milk, almond milk, soy milk, the CO2 equivalents per liter of milk. And here we are. Not quite 3, almond milk almost 4, soy milk high 3s. On that metric alone, you'd say, you know what? We look pretty good. When you do it as a kilogram of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of protein, here's milk, here's almond milk, here's soy, right? So soy and dairy are pretty good. They're pretty equivalent because of the protein content of the soy milk, right? So they're using a metric that is common to all of them. Almond doesn't do it. If you look at eutrophication, so in other words, where the nitrogen goes, how that might impact the environment. Dairy doesn't look as good. Almond and soy look better. Ecotoxicity, dairy doesn't look as good. Herbicides and pesticides and things like that. That's what's coming in there. I'm going to go fast through this. There's a discussion of ecotoxicity. Fossil fuel depletion. We don't look quite as good here on a megajoule per liter of milk. These guys are using some, we're using more. So not so good, but if you put it on a unit of protein, get almond milk, we beat almond milk. Soy milk has got us by a little bit there, but we're talking about tenths of units. Okay. Cumulative energy demand. This is interesting. This is cradle to gate kind of things. We're not all much different. It takes energy to do all of this, right? This was my point about anything that we do has an environmental impact. We've got to recognize that. Almond is not any different here in energy energy demand than dairy milk or soy milk. If you do it on a protein basis on energy demand, man, we look good, especially compared to almond milk, right? Soy looks pretty good, right? So we can't bash them on a protein basis. Almond doesn't come close, right? I think this is partly what Starbucks became aware of, is that the decision to move towards almond really wasn't a good decision, because almond isn't necessarily, as a beverage, almonds are great, right? Very nutritious, selenium, fiber, all that kind of stuff. We can get into the nutrition of it, but when you put it into a beverage, it doesn't look good. So the ecotoxicity, I'm going to skip through this slide. Here's the one, water intake, liters of water per liters of milk or beverage. Dairy's around 10. Almond milk was 1,000. Soy's right around 10, 9.5. Right, so again, dairy and soy look pretty good. Almonds are a very water intensive crop. And I think most people don't know that, right? Like, we just don't know where our food comes from when we don't understand the food chain. Look at it per unit of protein. Soy and dairy are pretty comparable. Almonds through the roof, right? It's not quite 1,000 times, but it's a lot. So, right, when you put some of these metrics on a nutrient basis, dairy looks really good, right? Soy doesn't look too bad on a protein basis, but when you add in all the rest of the nutrients that I showed you from the Smedman paper, well, we look good. We've got to get our metrics like this because we produce food for nutrients. And that's got to be part of our discussion. One more thing real quick. Anybody who knows anything about the Chinese dairy industry knows that they had a melamine scare years ago. Not a scare, they had a scandal. They lost the trust of their consumer. They are working very, very hard to get that back. We're at modern dairy here, 22,000 lactating cows on one site with all the heifers and dry cows. You cannot see each end of this dairy from the observation tower, right? This is one large unit. Milk's processed and packaged on site. My point here, one more thing we have to do in the dairy industry if we're going to beat back all of this. So we have to explain, where food's coming from and how things get used. We also have to be completely transparent. And this is one of the hardest things for us because we're not good at it. Dairy farmers by nature are introverts, don't want to deal with people. So the idea that we're going to embrace people, it's just counterintuitive, right? But you walk in the dairy and we're in the processing area here, where we're looking at a model of the dairy, and you turn around and on the wall, what do you see? You see very large monitors all tied together. You can see all of the milking parlors running at real time. You can see the feed area. You can see the cows. You can see the mixing area. You can see the cows eating. You can see how much feed's in the feed bunk. You can see the calves. Nothing on this dairy is hidden. It is completely transparent. Anybody that walks in can see everything, everywhere, including the employees. Here we are from the observation area looking over two of the parlors. A couple things to note. Notice how clean it is. Notice how clean the cows are. This wasn't done for our purpose. This is like this every day. I've been to these dairies. They look like this all the time. They're trying to win the trust of their consumer. They're trying to be as transparent as possible. I think our future means we have to think something like this. We can have a Fair Oaks. We can have the Wisconsin Discovery Center that was just built on the Fair Oaks idea. That's also a great thing. I was just up there last week with the Dairy Challenge. But we as dairy producers have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Why did I take this picture? Look what's on the wall in the parlor. Any worker here can look up and see what's going on everywhere, right? And I think that's it's both impressive, it's daunting, probably a little scary, but we have to embrace this kind of thinking. So just to summarize, you've seen this slide. I think we're making progress. We've got to do more. We've got to relate on an emotional basis. We've got to remember that we're eating for nutrients and everything has an environmental impact. We need to help everybody understand the food system, the whole thing, right? Because I think that's part of our discussion, but we also have to help them understand it so we don't penalize cows as much as we are, because we're disposing of things that would really cost a lot of money and have a much larger environmental impact if we weren't feeding them to cows or other animals. We got to figure out this net zero thing. There's a bunch of people working on it. We'll get there. Stay tuned. We got to figure out how to make sure the dairies get the credit for the carbon that they're using and managing. And we need to be transparent. And with that, stop. We can evaluate things with the CNCPS. We can do nitrogen, phosphorus, greenhouse gas bases. We can help CAFO planners. We can do lots of things. We just have to change the way we think a little bit and be a little more proactive about it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, that completes the presentation part of the webinar. Thank you, Mike. Also, thank you for joining us. We do these for you, and we hope we provide good information. As a reminder, Dr. Van Amburgh's slides will be available as a PDF document for download from our website. That page has links to the recording and the PDF presentation there. I do convert the audio to podcasts. You can find those under the podcast tab on the website or subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Next month's webinar will feature Dr. Elliot Block, Research Fellow, Director of Technology, Animal Nutrition and Food Production at Church & Dwight, talking about palm oil and its role as a sustainable feed source. Join us on May 12th, again at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. We will be following the same format as this webinar, featuring AMTS office hours 30 minutes prior to the start of each. So, show up early if you have any nutrition questions or program-related questions. We will get to questions in a few minutes. First, I need to thank my team and my sponsors. I thank my co-hosts and my team who joined for office hours. My super supportive team, starting with the incomparable Lynn Gilbert and the infallible Tom Taluki from AMTS. We have a hard-working group of AMTS distributors who also helped with questions from their compatriots and offer other country perspectives. Elena Bonfante of Dairy Innovations Italia in Italy, Marty Traxler of La Tech and AgroLab in Mexico, Sean Lee of AnsciTech in China, and Ignacio Riano from JEPSA in Argentina joined us for the morning session. Dr. Van Amburgh had a scheduling issue that prohibited participation at the start of the first question period. Dr. Larry Chase, Professor Emeritus at Cornell, whose work Mike referenced, graciously agreed to step in at the very last minute to field questions. He and Tom filled in with the hope that Mike might be able to join later. We are uniquely fortunate to have access to the people who created and thoroughly understand these topics. I am extraordinarily grateful. The second webinar was co-hosted by Dr. Marcos Neves Vieira of the University of Lavras in Brazil and the excellent team of Paula Turillo and her translators, Paula Alanes and Miriam Strauss from Afina in Argentina. We were joined in the morning webinar by Dr. Huday Kavustran, as well as also he joined us in the evening, which put him there very, very early in his morning. We have a wonderfully supportive group of sponsors who allow us to pay for our speakers and help justify my time commitment to this project. We thank our gold sponsors, Arm & Hammer, Animal and Food Production, #ScienceHearted, the Canola Council of Canada. Learn more about feeding canola at canolamazing.com. Adina, experts in animal nutrition with expertise in plant bioactives, and Proteca, transforming the future of farm animal health. Our silver sponsors are the Forage analysis labs of Dairyland Laboratories and Dairy One, both with affiliates around the world. At ASEO, ruminant nutrition solutions to ensure animal performance, and Novamil from Novita Nutrition. Our bronze sponsors are Amino Max, Virtus Nutrition, Origination Inc., and Balchem. Each of these companies support education and research worldwide. We hope that you consider them in your formulation decisions. Now you will find the question sessions one after the other. All right, we're good. Somebody talk other than me, please.
Hi, Marianne.
Hi, Lynn. Thank
Come
you.
on, Lynn. I was going to let her hang there for a little while longer.
You'll notice I just said you were infallible, not infallible.
Oh, hell.
So, Larry, thank you again for pinch hitting, and Tom, thank you too. You're my go-to for like, can you answer questions? Elena, I routinely let you lead off. Do you have any questions from your end?
Hi, Marianne. Thank you. So no questions so far, but probably just a comment from me that, I think we, as an industry, as the dairy industry, we actually answer questions, or we try to find the solution when the problem raises up. So I think this is a topic that it's, real, and we have to face. But I think also is not only, how can I say, something that is asked from the farmer, but is also an opportunity to be more efficient, I think, because everything then has to be profitable for them as well. So probably next time, yes, we have to be transparent, but also proactive, I think, and that's something I hope will change in the future.
Thank you, Elena. I think Lynn and I have been in a couple conferences, and certainly we've seen in the last year, and I think a lot of emphasis has recently been on the area of emissions. Anytime you look on any sort of social media, there's a lot of bashing of animal agriculture that gets pretty frustrating because the information that they have is contrary to what we know from a science aspect. And that's part of what drove us to want to do these webinars. And I think it comes down to, Mike said, we need to get out there and we need to talk about it. And that's where I'm coming from, in that let's get some facts. And then all of you people who are listening, if you have any sort of presence or you talk to non-industry people, if we can just talk about it, because you hear incorrect information all the time. So that's exactly what you're saying too, Elena. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your comment. I'm gonna go through our distributors real quick, and then I'll start on the questions. Marty, you've been here the longest so far, and try not to be distracted by Tom. I can turn off his camera. Marty, do you have any thoughts or comments that you want to make on this topic?
I guess I was thinking back a little bit when Mike was talking about the study that Bauman did, looking at how the dairy industry has improved in the carbon footprint. And I just come back a little bit thinking that there are consumer groups in the US and probably in other parts of the world as well that are kind of competing against each other. I guess I would say you have the environmentalists that say that we need to reduce the carbon footprint in agriculture and all this. But then there are other groups that are taking away technology that can help us in that regard. And the one that's most evident, I think, for most of us would be RBST. That had or could have a huge impact in reducing the carbon footprint, and that's basically been taken away from us.
Does anyone here think that that would be revisited? Tom says no. Yeah,
don't
because
think we had
I've thought the same thing, is that here we have something that reduces your need inputs, what, 12% typically? But
It's not going to be revisited though. It's dead in the water, I think.
that's unfortunate. Is Tom going to say something? Yes.
Look, as a dairy industry, we compete against ourselves. You know, the whole non-GMO milk, the whole organic, the whole grass-fed, the whole, I mean, it's insanity. So we don't do a good job as a dairy industry, as an animal ag industry. We don't do a good job telling our side of the story in a consistent manner. It's crazy. The sad thing is, when someone does start popping up, talking about it and showing some of the positive light, we're thrown under the bus by the activists as being in the pockets of big corporate, and they don't want to hear the science. So much of what these groups talk about is more emotional driven, and that's really difficult to counteract with science. We really need to develop some good spokespeople that have the trust and can make the connection on the overall, on the general consumer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm gonna jump. I said I was gonna have distributors talk first, but I want to get to some of the questions because I don't want our listeners frustrated with our talk before we get to some of those questions. I'll start with a question that I had from Aiden Cushnahan, and he's asking, and I was curious about this because you know my preferences. Does a smaller breed of cow produce the same milk? If a breed of smaller cows, and this could be smaller Holsteins, can produce the same milk output, will the animal have lower emissions or produce milk with a lower carbon footprint?
Only if they can do it at a lower level of dry matter intake. You know, we could make a smaller cow that gave the same level of milk and had the same dry matter intake, theoretically, and there would be very, very little difference. But if they could give the same level of milk at, say, 10% lower dry matter intake, yeah, absolutely. The problem is, I don't think it's possible because of intake limitations and how that's all related. Intake and milk is related to body size. So that's kind of like the pink unicorn that everyone would love to find, Aiden.
Would feed, we talked some back when we were discussing rates of passage and stuff. What about feed processing? Would that have an influence on the ability to do for intake and production? How would that be?
It would have some effect. You know, let's look at it this way. What are the two biggest drivers on dry matter intake? Body weight and fiber digestibility. So there's not a whole lot that we can do on manipulating body weight, especially if we want to continue with higher levels of milk. Roughly, you know, if we go back and we look at a bunch of things, you know, cows are going to peak 11-12% of body weight. And to try and get a smaller cow to peak at 15% of body weight, that's really, eventually I could see it being possible, but when we think about the metabolic efficiency of the cow currently and how hard she is actually working to metabolize all these nutrients. We are really talking about increasing metabolic rate on these animals to go higher than that a lot. I think one of the bigger issues is if we accept this fact, if we acknowledge that cows have genetic capacity, and there's farms that do it, there's cows that can do it, to peak and be producing at 10, 11, 12, maybe 13% of body weight. How many cows across all of our herds actually achieve that? So I don't think it's an issue at this point of how do we make a smaller cow that gives a same level of milk. It's how do we get the cows that we have produce closer to what their genetic potential is, because that's where we can really have an impact. Of course, though, that means if we want to reduce the overall greenhouse gas emission side, that means less cows.
Right.
So that there's always that challenge. Feed processing is an interesting one because that can have some impact on dry matter intake, especially if we start talking about particle size on forages. But I think let's carry this through from the nitrogen side where Mike was going some as well, that as we look at enhancing protein and amino acid nutrition, we could be feeding lower levels of high protein products or reduce that excessive nitrogen feeding through some feed processing. Or we can flip it around and talk about the starch side, the energy side of if we increase starch degradability in the rumen, we can feed an overall lower level of starch. The flip side of that, though, is if we increase the digestibility of these products and we feed less of them, what are we going to displace that with? Are we going to do more forage? Okay, so then the whole forage quality issue comes into play. Are we going to rely more on byproducts? Well, in some places in the world, let's look at what some of these byproducts are. I'll just pull one out of the air. Corn gluten feed. Okay product, but it's coming in with 20% protein. That's a really bad amino acid pattern. And if we don't need that extra nitrogen and we end up feeding it, it's sort of self-defeating if we think about it that way. Or the bigger challenge is in parts of the world where a lot of these byproducts that we would normally be feeding are going into methane digesters because of the subsidies that some of these digesters are getting to produce electricity. So it's kind of a tough spot. The best I can say is we should be focusing on how do we get these cows to get closer to their productivity levels in terms of genetic potential, and everything that entails, management wise, feeding wise, forage quality, and be watching how we reduce some of these this excess nitrogen and phosphorus that we end up feeding all over the world.
So I have a couple questions based on what you said, but I wanted to just ask, is there potential for the energy required for the additional processing to offset the gains that you might make through efficiency and consumption? Because we have to start looking at it from
the whole
all
life cycle, whole life cycle analysis. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
So back to that smaller cow, more efficient question of Aiden's, just to finish this one out, and then what I'll do is I'll circle to Sean Lee and ask if he has any comments from his perspective, and then come back to some of the questions. Steve Nice has quite a few about amino acids and protein. I want to get to those.
I see that.
So would what you're discussing about the efficiency, would that be a Holstein Jersey crossbred cow? Would that apply? Any evidence that they're showing improved efficiency compared to just a straight Holstein?
Not that I've seen anything published. There's a little bit, but I don't know if it's been studied enough to really come up with a number. We know that first generation has heterosis impact that will improve some of that efficiency. But then the second generations are actually, if you take a Hojo and breed it back to a Holstein or a Jersey, you've lost it all. So I don't know. That's an interesting question, Aiden.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna ask Sean Lee. Sean, do you have any comments or questions with regards to what you're seeing the discussion in China?
Hi, Maria. Yeah, I have not thought about much. Just woke up.
Yeah.
So,
You sounded it.
Well, he texted me last night at like 10 o'clock. He's like, "Hey,
Yeah.
call me. I usually go to bed. I usually go to bed about 2." I'm like, "Well, I go to bed about 1, but I'm still not going to call you at that late."
sorry. Let me prepare, and in the evening I bring my question back to you.
That's a good plan.
That sounds good.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Did you say you were going to come in the evening?
Yes,
I
he
can't
did.
multitask. All right.
Yes,
Very good.
yes, he did.
Very good. Let's address some of those questions about Steve that Steve sent in. And just to reiterate a discussion we were having in the office hours, Steve was the one who asked the question about how reliable are the MUNs from the bulk tank, and do you keep the diet protein and amino acids correct? I am just going to read his questions, Tom, and then you can suss them out. Larry, jump in.
Jump in, Larry.
Yeah. So Steve's questions: the pig and poultry diets are balanced for amino acids much more aggressively than dairy, yet the manure is heavily laden with nitrogen. Poultry manure is even pelleted for fertilizer, and I believe he's in Michigan there. And how is our diet balancing for amino acids going to be better? And I'm going to add to it, what effect do the recommendations, I asked this in our team meeting, the NASEM recommendations, as you referenced earlier, Tom, stop making that face. As you referenced earlier, they're calling for higher nitrogen. From my stupid readings of it, they're increasing our, for lack of a better term, crude protein. And I know that it's a different way of looking at it. Larry and Tom, love to hear your take on this and answer Steve's questions.
Hey, you're it, Larry.
Well, I think the problem, the NASEM calculation, they don't account for any recycling, for one thing. And there's some challenges with the RDP system that they're using. So they will actually call for more protein if you use that system, at least from the few reports I've seen and the few comparisons that have been made. Is that what you've seen, Tom?
Absolutely.
Yep. And so I think the industry is sort of seeing that also. So we don't want to be negative on the NASEM group because they did a really, really good job and overall, but there's some lacks of data sometimes. And when they have lacks of data, they have to make estimates, guesstimates, or whatever. And I think that's a piece of the puzzle here. But they do call for more protein, yes.
That was a great way to put it, Larry. Thank you. That's an interesting observation you threw out there, Steve, about about how high. Oh, well, wait. How high really is the nitrogen content of swine and poultry manure? That's an interesting issue, because we hear a lot about the odors, especially with swine manure, but that's because of how the manure is handled and how much ammonia is being generated. So I would have to go back and do some digging as to what the actual nitrogen content is. And with poultry, yeah, I'm familiar with the pelleted poultry litter stuff that was started in on the Delmarva by Purdue a number of years ago. And their nitrogen, isn't, a lot of their nitrogen isn't as volatile because birds don't produce urine. So it's a different product. But again, it would be interesting to go back and look at what the nutrient analysis is of those different manure types. Then again, we're relying heavily on a lot of forages, on a lot more indigestible material going into the manures that cows produce. In general, if you go back to the 80s and the 70s, and you look at where crude protein levels were on a lot of those monogastric diets, it was nothing for them to be 20, 21. Go back to some of the older NRCs, and you'd see those recommendations. And as they have formulated more for amino acids, layers is a great example. Just go into a farm store and look at the tag for what they're saying, what they use for layer feed. And the general stuff, that the commodity grain that you buy in like a Tractor Supply or like that is a 16% pellet now. And if you look at those, and they are pretty decent with amino acid profiles. So I think they've made great progress. I think it's been easier for them because they have a wider selection of synthetic amino acids to work with. We're pretty limited at this point. But there is definitely, and I think as Mike showed that, 14% crude protein we can make work. We start going below that, we can run into some challenges and some productivity losses. So I think there's kind of this base minimum just because of supplying adequate amounts of essentials and non-essentials to make sure that we have the total amino acid supply that we need in the right relationships with each other and with energy. So I think it'll change where we're going to run into a challenge with really going to let's say 5 amino acids, formulating off of 5 amino acids is our ingredients selections, our nutrient sources. We start, you look at all the byproducts that we feed. Look at how much corn protein we feed, and look at the amino acid profile of corn. It's kind of crappy. So that's going to be our biggest challenge. I think Mike's work, as well as some others' work, clearly shows what is possible. How we're going to be able to implement that widespread, that's going to be the challenge. And that's going to be we're going to run into that challenge this year globally because of ingredient sourcing and ingredient availability. And let's look at it just from the US, and this will greatly impact Canada and Mexico as well. Our government just announced earlier this week to reduce the price of gas, that all the refineries can go to E15. Well, over 40% of the US corn crop already goes to ethanol. And if they all go to E15, that's a 50% increase in corn utilization for that. So that takes us up to like 65% of the corn crop going to ethanol. And we were already talking about a lower corn crop in terms of acreage for the year. We're going to end up being heavily dependent upon some of these byproducts. How much more distillers is going to be out there, and how are we going to feed it? So right off the bat, we're going to be challenged with how do we make nitrogen efficient diets, methane efficient diets, because we're going to be dealing with more fibrous byproduct. And if we look at where methane really, the drivers of methane production are related to fiber. So it's going to be a challenge. We're being asked to focus on these areas, yet our availability of some of the tools that we could use to mitigate that, or some of the ingredients to mitigate that, are being taken away from us. So again, some of it needs to go back to, we got to have these overall discussions with the public as to what we're actually doing and what we've actually done. It's not going to be easy, and it's really gonna make us think.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I hope that got Steve's questions answered for him. I'm going to pop over to some of the questions in the chat window, and this is almost more of a question than or a comment than a question. And I know you're going to roll your eyes, so get ready to control your face, Tom. Has anyone shared? This is from April Wright Lucas, and she understands how things work. Has anyone shared this with the Human Nutrition College at Cornell? There needs to be a consistent information. This is an excellent presentation, and she's going to review it again. But we need, as we said earlier, and Elena reiterated, we need to get this information out to not just our audience, but to the 98% that is clueless. So Tom and Larry, working within the system at Cornell, I'm sure there's been cross college reaching, but yeah, can you address that?
I think Mike Van Amburgh and Joe McFadden have had some conversations with the human nutrition people. I'm not sure to what degree or in what depth, but I know they've had some interaction.
And I'll take this a step further. Actually, it's really a it goes beyond that. It goes into, we should be having some of those conversations with the med schools, with the nursing programs, because the dietitians that would come out of Cornell, out of the human nutrition side, they have their career path and like that. But a lot of nutrition information to the human side actually goes through healthcare providers. So we should focus on, we should try to get this information to them as well. At the same time, it's we should try and find a couple of great spokespeople that are well known.
That are chefs.
Not even here, great example. We've got the new mayor of New York City, who he's vegan, so now he's decided that he's going to change the school lunch program in New York City so that every Friday is vegan Friday. Where's the nutritional considerations on discussions like that? Again, so much of it's tied back to emotion. We got to have the right spokespeople to address these with the general public, as well as healthcare. Healthcare is a big one that we need to get into.
Well, and I'm sure this is anybody else's experience, but when you go to your doctor and they're recommending that they're asking you about your diet, they're saying you're drinking low-fat dairy, you're eating low-fat dairy, and they don't say a word about sugar, which is, and Lynn and I were in Starbucks a little bit this week, and we both got lattes, and the guy says, "Is 2% okay?" And I said, "No, I want whole milk." And then I questioned whether he looked at me and said I should have 2%, but that's another story. It's just that it's the emphasis on, not the emphasis. It's the emphasis on fat's the bad one, and they don't pay any attention to the intake of carbs or sugars.
It takes, by the time a policy is changed like that, and it's really worked through to let's just go through healthcare, until it works through to the doctor or the PA or the nurse that you see when you go to the doctor's office, it's 20 years. It's basically, it's begins with training the new generation, and then that trickles down through the organization wherever they end up. But it takes a full generational change, and unfortunately, that's just the way it is.
Well, for those of you still here for questions, Mike just joined us. Mike, to catch you up, I've had the good fortune to have Larry join us to pinch hit with questions. And we've been asking a lot of things, making some comments. I'm going to move to, and Mike, I can bring up your slides so that we can reference that. Right now, we're just looking at all of us. So let me get to the slide in question and do a new share. And I can't ever talk and click at the same time. So this is slide 5 from Mike's question, and let's get to the share. So many windows.
Ah, Van Amberg's new nickname, Batman.
Fat man.
Batman.
Batman.
Come on.
Let's see. Hold on. I got to change my PowerPoint share. If I close this one, maybe it'll give me a different one. Sorry, all. There we go. Nope, that's not it. I have too many things going on. There we go. So the question, Mike, is based on the gas production and combustion of top 5 byproduct slide, what are the thoughts on byproduct choice or use with increased popularity of installation of anaerobic digesters on farms? They've looked at reducing methane, but will this change if producers can capture and use that methane for energy creation?
Yeah. Well, so my take on that's pretty simple. We want to feed, right now feed's at a real premium no matter where you go. My suggestion is I wouldn't look at it that way. We want to feed whatever we can to get the highest total tract digestibility in the cow, right? Because we need that feed efficiency, especially with feed prices as high as they are. So I wouldn't worry about what goes into the digester. I understand your point because a lot of these guys are going to make a lot of money on the RNG and things like that. But we're still going to have to push feed efficiency. So we want to drive our diets that way. And again, we may become a two-headed monster, right? In some regards, because that RNG in some situations may be more or as lucrative as the milk is, right? In terms of margin. But
Mike,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I ask you to get either closer to the microphone, or for me, it's sounding a little bit quiet, but that may be just on my end.
No, it's not on just your end.
Okay. Or start yelling.
How about now?
It's well, you'd have to say more. It sounds pretty similar to me, but go ahead.
How about now?
That's
Okay.
better.
All right. I've got my professional headset on. So the bottom line is we want the highest efficiency we can possibly get. So then the reason we want that, not only we want high feed efficiency for a profit reason, we want high efficiency because we're still being driven to reduce the amount of carbon output per unit of milk produced. And I know that the RNG thing is going to help that out, right? There's going to be a big push there for that. But per unit of milk, if you don't have an RNG outlet, you need to make as much milk per unit of input. So we've got to make sure we take care of the feed efficiency. So I wouldn't select byproducts based on what might be indigestible just so they can go into the biogas unit. There's going to be plenty of things there to digest. I understood the question correctly.
Okay. Tom or Mike, as I listened to your thing earlier, since I don't have any other questions right now, does the use of animal byproducts like blood meal affect the way that IPCC would look at carbon dioxide emissions, or is it in such small quantities it's not a factor, or don't they know?
You're not going to make a lot of methane from. They don't worry about CO2 directly. They worry about methane and methane equivalents on a CO2 basis.
Mike, this is that you just dropped out entirely.
I have no idea what's going on because I'm directly wired to the computer and I've got my best headset on.
Mike. Tom, can you hear him?
No, it's the same thing. It's something's not working right with his headset.
Yeah, this is what I experienced with the whole video. I don't know if you can hear us, Mike.
How about now?
That's better. At least we can hear you.
Well, now.
That seems fine. If that was swearing, we could hear that.
It was awesome.
I did not swear. I did not swear. There was no F word. I inserted another letter. Glad you heard it. I have no idea what's going on. So the use of blood meal is you're not going to make a lot of methane from blood meal. So yeah, it's actually going to be a very efficient feed in terms of milk per unit of carbon.
Okay.
How's that? Anything that doesn't have cellulose or hemicellulose in it is going to be good.
Okay. So unless we get more questions, Mike, thanks for joining.
No, that's okay. I unfortunately have to go to another class anyhow. So
okay, I have a question. Has anyone examined the economics? Because we talk about the need to be more efficient and driving the idea that we are probably going to be regulated for our emissions, and we certainly are being dinged in popular press. Has anyone looked at the economics of being more efficient, the going from 15% to 15.5% crude protein, or in the other way? And what does that return? Or is there on the horizon, this is a lot wrapped into one, on the horizon, the idea of giving incentives to the dairymen for better emissions performance? And I'm also thinking of how would we measure this? There's like the mixer audits. Is there anything that would be similar in that?
boy, that's the way you asked that, Marianne. It's really complicated.
I know.
I don't know which one of those things to answer first.
Well, answer the one that makes sense.
Well, do we know how to do this auditing? The answer is no. It's a real frustrating thing to me because I'm involved with many different groups. I'm on the tangent of many different groups. I advise many different groups. State level, federal level, whatever, nobody can get their head around how to do this. They're all working at the 30, 40,000 feet area, and the idea of doing this at the cow level still isn't there, especially here in New York State. The economics of it, the economics are always going to favor maximizing forage and minimizing any purchase fee, as long as we have forage quality that allows us to do it. And then the carbon's going to follow that. It sounds antithetical because the more forage, you're going to get more methane just by virtue of fermentation. But there's ways, if it's highly digestible forage, then the methane's not as extreme, right? The lower the digestibility, the harder the bugs have to work, the more methane we get. That sounds kind of funny, but it seems, you get more ND solubles in that forage, the better off we're all going to be.
I'm going to challenge you on that forage comment, Mike, about it's always going to be cheaper. Because if knowing places in the world where they're paying over $500 an acre for cash rents, and if we do alfalfa on that, and we get 4 ton of dry matter, say, that gets pretty damn expensive alfalfa.
Well, but that's a business model decision, Tom. I completely agree with you when you put it that way. But if you're gonna grow cows and you're gonna have cows, then I think the decision on how we do that has to change, right? Our models of a postage stamp dairy, and we're gonna buy all of our food.
I agree completely with that.
We're not going to be able to control the quality of forage and take what we can buy and then try to make the best with it. I think that's partly what's gotten us into this. And that's not to damn the industry, right? It's just more of it keeps evolving. And 20 years ago, nobody cared about this stuff, right? 10 years ago, nobody cared about it or talked about it. Now all of a sudden, we have to care about it, and there's financial metrics and sustainability metrics around it, and we're really struggling with that. That's my concern, because we talked to some friends in Italy, especially some friends in Sicily right now. They don't know what to feed a cow. Most of their byproducts come from the Ukraine. And there's no transportation. Transportation's outrageously expensive, and there's no food availability. They're trying to figure out what the heck they're going to feed cows. Again, because they don't, and we know they have forage, but it's resource limited. Okay, I do have to go to the classroom now again.
Well,
It's just how
we've
my
had-
world works.
so unless we have any more questions, is everybody in consensus that it's a good time to end it for the morning, and then we'll come back to more questions this afternoon?
Yep. Sounds like a
All
plan.
right. Now, I am going to, before I open up and say welcome, or as I do that, and before I go to any of my co-hosts, I'm going to tackle a question that we had at the beginning of the webinar. This is not necessary. This is not related to the topic, but since we have Mike Van Amburgh, who's in charge of the CNCPS, and Tom Tolucki, who's in charge of AMTS here, and everybody asked this question. This was from Mike Hudgens, who had to leave. Does AMTS have the 2021 equations? And I'm assuming he means the NASEM equations, and what will be included in the CNCPS. Ready?
So, yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, and you sound great. Thank you.
Yep. So what we're going to do with NASEM, we have run a bunch of evaluations. What is most important to us right now are all the data, the new data on minerals and vitamins, and probably one of the dry matter intake equations. Other than that, at this point, given our evaluations of our internal evaluations, and we actually have a data set from the NRC committee or the NASEM committee that we're working on. There's a joint publication coming where we're going to compare NASEM 2021, NASEM 2001, and CNCPS 6.55. And given all of that work, all right, I'm being transparent about that. No, the paper is not submitted yet, but we're working on it. We don't see any need to add anything else other than the mineral and vitamin data. We are building a calf and heifer model from the same data set, since it's a shared data set that was curated here. And we presented it to Drakely and to Bandahar. So we're going to do something a little bit different with the data than what the NASEM did. The calf model in NASEM is very good, but we're going to kind of streamline it a little bit with the through the weaning process and into the more mature heifer. I think that's probably it.
Okay, thank you, Mike, for that summary. Everybody asked. And Tom, why don't you, I could say what I think I know, but it's much better you saying, because you know what we're going to do. You're unmuted, but I don't hear anything.
That's usually my role.
Yeah. Well, until Tom gets that sorted out, my understanding is we are a CNCPS based model. We will do what the CNCPS does, but maybe there's something special. Mike, you probably know that.
How
better
about
than
now?
I. Oh,
There you
good. You're
go.
great.
There
Thank
you
you.
go.
Sorry about that. My battery on my headset was dying, so I put it into charge and it turned off. Okay.
All right.
So we will do the minerals and intake equations like CNCPS is doing, like Mike said. For the rest of the model, very, very low probability we'll do anything with, because it's so inconsistent with the biology that we currently utilize with CNCPS. It introduces a lot of challenges for us to go anywhere further with NASEM than the minerals and intake equations.
Okay. Thank you, both of you. Very good, succinct answers. I'm going to go to Paula first, if Paula is ready with some questions, and then Hudai will come back to you and Sean. But Paula usually has quite a few questions. Until I see some in my window, I will direct you, Paula, if you're ready. I know you have to do some translating, but if you want to ask some of your questions, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you? Thank you very much, Mike, for your presentation.
Sure, good to hear you.
I have many questions. The first one is the milk urea nitrogen, can it be considered as an indicator of environmental impact? If so, which would be the optimum values?
So we can use milk urea nitrogen. No, that's a very good question. We can use milk urea nitrogen. There's a few caveats to using milk urea nitrogen. One of those is up until recently, the labs in the US, I can only speak to the US, were not very accurate. They're doing better now, and they were more accurate at the higher levels than they were at the lower concentrations of milk urea nitrogen. So as long as we're comfortable that the numbers we're receiving from the lab are adequate, they can be useful. The correlation between milk urea nitrogen and urinary nitrogen excretion is reasonable, not great, but reasonable, because the plasma urea pool will, obviously the kidney is actively filtering, whereas milk urea nitrogen is a passive process down a concentration gradient. And you can always evaluate milk urea nitrogen accuracy by looking at a plasma urea nitrogen in the same cow and trying to figure out if milk urea nitrogen is higher than plasma urea nitrogen, then they were inaccurate in their measurement, because it cannot be higher than the plasma generally. All that being said, a reasonable number is probably between 8, this is in milk urea nitrogen, is 8 to 10 milligrams per deciliter. What we know through research is that when you approach 6 milligrams per deciliter, both in milk urea nitrogen or plasma, that the plasma pool of nitrogen is at a point where it's low enough that the rumen will be at 0 nitrogen balance. So where we predict, nitrogen balance in the rumen, probably better than we predict PUNs right now, or MUNs. Anything at 6 or lower means the rumen's at risk of being negative for rumen nitrogen, and forage digestibility and microbial function will decrease. So we tend to set it somewhere between 8 and 10 as a reliable number for ensuring that rumen function is adequate, but yet we're not overfeeding nitrogen to the cows.
Perfect.
Paula,
may I go on?
Yes, please. Please, why don't you, if you have like ones, group them, or if you have just a couple, go to them, and then we'll bring in Marcos and Hudai.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks.
The second question I have is the study of the 8 dairies you showed us was done through the model, or did you also measure real excreted nitrogen?
Mike,
No.
do you want me to bring up that slide, by the way?
No, I got it.
Oh, but for demonstration purposes. I know you know what you're saying.
Oh, sure. If you want to, that's fine, Marianne.
Yeah,
I'm good with
do
whatever you want to
share.
do.
All right, let me find it. Go ahead and start talking. and I'll
Yeah.
get it.
So in all these cases, this is predicted by the model. Because we have not figured out how to do total collection on a farm on that scale. And if we did, we'd most likely be much more inaccurate than just the predictions. And that sounds funny to say that, but as long as we understand the feed chemistry and we understand the dry matter intakes and cow body weights and milk, energy corrected milk output, then we do a very good job of predicting nitrogen excretion. Keep going, Marianne.
Okay.
Next one there. Nope.
Which
19.
numbers? Okay.
19. There. Yeah, so this is all predicted by the model. But if you can go, if we don't have the data here, if we could go back to the paper that describes the excretion models and the precision with which that works. Again, it's the data, the predictions are only as good as the input, right? And in this case, Larry Chase ran this study. They did weigh as many cows as they could. They did monitor dry matter intake. They did a tremendous amount of forage chemistry, considering where they were when this was, where the industry was when they did this. So we feel pretty comfortable with these predictions, right? Are they 100% accurate? The answer is no, but they're more accurate. I will tell you, from having done a lot of total collection studies on this scale with hundreds of cows, they're more accurate than any measurement we would ever make. So, yeah, I don't, and if you saw the data from Ryan Higgs's paper when that was published almost 10 years ago, they're fairly, it's a pretty sound set of prediction equations for both fecal and urinary nitrogen.
Okay, Paula, do you have
Okay.
another that you want to ask right now?
Yes, if I can.
Thank you.
Okay. The other question is, when you feed a diet that is balanced in metabolizable protein and amino acids, do you expect a lower nitrogen excretion?
Yes. Generally, if we're doing it correctly, then I would expect a lower nitrogen excretion if everything's balanced. The other caveat and the other part of that has to be taken into consideration is that we did not overfeed rumen available nitrogen, right? Because you can be MP balanced and you can be amino acid balanced and still be overfeeding rumen available nitrogen. And we have several examples of that here recently with case farm evaluations in our undergraduate program, where the farms, the nutritionists feeding these cows, we had a herd that had 3,700 cows. We had another herd with 2,700 cows, and both herds were fairly well balanced. MP supplies were adequate. Amino acids were reasonable, methionine and lysines particularly. But when we looked at the rumen N balance, it was 190%. And So you've got to be careful about MP and amino acids, because you also have to remember that there's no reason to overfeed rumen nitrogen. So we were able in the herd with 3,700 cows, we were able to reduce nitrogen feeding with a total value of about $400,000 a year. Right? Not because they hadn't balanced for amino acids and MP correctly, because they were grossly overfeeding nitrogen that was being degraded in the rumen, and that was being excreted. The 2,700 cow herd was $294,000 worth of excess protein because they were overfeeding the rumen nitrogen. So even though they were both balanced for MP, ME and MP, and some amino acid balancing, you can still overdo the protein because you've overfed the rumen. All right. So to me, if you're using the CNCPS, what I'm always looking at is I'm iterating between rumen nitrogen and MP balance and trying to get the rumen nitrogen, lower, right? We don't want to make it too low, but lower. If you want to, I'm comfortable at 120 or 125% right now. And because of daily fluxes in cow time budgets, I really don't want to go below 125. It's hard to get that low sometimes with some of the forages that we have, the fermented forages. But if you can get it down, and in the particular herd that I was describing, they were both in that 180 to 190 range, right? So we could bring it down to 150, 145, and remove a significant amount of feed protein that wasn't needed, rebalance the diet a little bit by bringing in some more carbohydrate, make some more microbial protein, and meet the MP and amino acids and be much more efficient overall. So yes, I do expect it to be different, but don't forget to look at the rumen, because I think that's generally where I see us overfeeding, primarily because I think a lot of nutritionists, one, it can be some of the least lower cost proteins, if there is such a thing today. But also we are afraid of, the variation around the feed causing a loss in production. And we don't want to do that. So we tend to overfeed protein that almost always has a higher rumen degradability.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We're going to come back to some questions that Paula has a little bit later. And I'm going to offer Huday Kavustran, our distributor in Turkey, an opportunity to ask any questions that he might have. Hi, Huday.
Hi, Marian. Yeah, thank you, Mike. It was really nice presentation that now we have a full of weapons to defend our industry against the people that are defending against the dairy business.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really nice. I got lots of I picked up lots of good ideas that to use in my life. So I'm curious about the artificial meat. It's becoming really popular, and the people keeps talking about this one. If we evaluate the environmental effect of the natural meat production compared to the artificial meat.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea?
I don't have a discrete idea like I did between the almond and soy and cow's milk. I do know that work is being done. A few of us have tried to make some calculations, but I don't like the ones that I've seen so far because I don't think they're large enough in scope. I think it's going to be hard to tell. But when I look at the list of ingredients in some of this, these in effect the veggie burgers, there can be 40 to 45 ingredients in there. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the problem with trying to come up with a number right now is they're not in there in high concentration. or high quantity, but getting a handle on each of them and then getting a sum for that and what that means from a CO2, greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide perspective has been really difficult. And so no, I don't have a good answer. The only thing I can tell you to help us all feel better is that some of the companies that are out there that have been putting out those burgers, or that food, whatever you want to call it, their cash flow is not very good. So we're seeing the consumer uptake for some of that not nearly as high as what some of those companies thought they were going to see. Yep. So that I think is a real positive thing, at least from a dairy beef industry perspective. But you know, they're still out there. They've got a market share, but it hasn't grown nearly as fast as they thought it was going to.
Okay, thank you.
Terrific. Hudai, do you have any other questions?
No, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for asking that. I thought that was a pretty good one. Let's see, Sean, this morning, we do you have anything that you want to give a question about? Lost my ability to speak.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Professor. It's excellent talk, and I learned a lot. I have 2 or 3 comments and 2 questions. Because my information about modern dairy, I just make 2 comments about that. One is the modern dairy actually is really a good company. Yes, because the dairy industry in China suffered from the scandals, and since the beginning they did a very good job. Actually, one thing Michael didn't mention is on most of their farms, they have biogas digesters. And I think this, they also joined now the new owner actually Menu. So they joined some international programs, and the calculation is really good for them because they have biogas digesters. So now, like since last year, they're pushing very hard and to promote carbon neutral, practice. They're doing pretty good. But compared to this large dairy, the transparency, there's no doubt it's very important. I'm not sure, like in the Canadian dairy farmers, the family-owned business, their voice is small, and because themselves are quite small, and their image is really hard to, now the media, everything, put a very negative image and profile on this farmers. I'm not sure how they can voice, and because they're doing a lot of great things, family-owned business, entrepreneurship, and they love animals, most of them, and they're making milks. But the whole society seems look them a very negative way. I don't know. Compared to modern dairy, they're a big business. They have a lot of money, and they own the stock market. They can defend themselves a little bit better. That's one. Another one is about Starbucks. I don't know that they changed their practice, and ever since they made that announcement, I never went back to any Starbucks coffee shop. Maybe now it's time for me to go back. I love their coffee, but I just hate them. Ever since I read that news, I never went back. But anyway, that sounds very stupid. And my kid, they gave us very good information about almond milk, how stupid Starbucks was. There are 2 questions. One is about the shrinkage. Mike mentioned that briefly. But actually shrinkage is quite significant on a dairy farm. We know the silage, there about 10% to 15% shrinkage. You put a fresh corn in the bunker, 1,000 ton, you can only get maybe 850 to 900 kilo out. And also concentrated the shrinkage is quite significant as well. I don't know how we put that in the equation to calculate the carbon footprint. Maybe that's a question for Mike.
Sure, Sean. So thank you for that information about modern dairy. It's been quite a few years since I was there, so that they have moved into the compressed natural gas and biodigesters is good. I think all dairies should. I'd like it if all dairies could do that. On your comment about family farms, I use that to just make a point here in the US about the fact that somehow we as an industry, right? It doesn't have to be every farm, but we as an industry have to be more transparent. And it can't just be Fair Oaks Farm in Indiana or the Wisconsin Discovery Center that was just built to kind of parallel Fair Oaks. It needs to be more of those family dairies somehow. Somehow we need to be able to make that connection to our consumer so they can actually understand it, and they get off this idea of a factory farm and polluting everything, because I think the inability to see that is our problem, right? And yes, modern dairy has the resources to be able to address that in ways that some of the smaller dairies cannot. But hopefully we can figure out some way to do it. To your question about shrink, yes. So California, UC Davis did some studies a few years ago. I don't know if they created prediction equations from that, but they did run a study on shrink in California dairies, because the California Air Emissions Board was aware of silo gas production, methane, and other things, hydrogen sulfide, and made a mandate that they had to reduce that. So there was, a lot of discussion about packing densities and rate of filling and all that kind of stuff. So there are some data that exist, but I'm not sure if anybody's used it to do a calculation. We could do that. That fermentation process is well described. If we know how much went into the silo and we have some rough estimation of losses during fermentation to feed out, we could come up with that. And I think that's feasible. I don't think anybody's done it yet, but it's out there.
Yeah, for silage side, the density, there are research about like equation based on your density, how much dry matter you could save. You compact your silage better. Then, like I remember, it's every 100 kilo per square meter, you will reduce the dry matter loss for about 1.5%. There are two researches actually. That's the density. Also, if the farmers is using maybe inoculants. Last time in Tom's webinar, he mentioned that using inoculants also you can reduce your dry matter loss. And then oxygen barrel film, that one we marketed in China for many years. We did a lot of trials, and pretty much we know if you use the oxygen barrier film on top of the bunker or pile, and you could save about 1 to 2% more dry matter. That's also, I think that mathematically it's possible to calculate the shrinkage there to give an estimate, I guess. I'm not sure about the concentrated part, how they do that, but I hope they can somehow put that in the equation. Another one is about the precision farming you mentioned. Yeah, that's perfectly said. You made a very good point. Everybody asks to promote to do precision, but actually we are doing very, very good already. So maybe using precision sounds like we are not very precise. Actually, it's not. But anyway, so actually Dairyland recently promoting a portable IR, and in China, Tom and I went there, spent quite a lot of time. So many large dairies, we help them to set up the benchtop IR in their central lab, so that they can monitor their own forage, and then put that into CNCPS. I think that they're doing a pretty good job. I think there are a lot of things to be improved, but so far, I think that they're doing a good job about precision farming that side. Last one is actually related to the biogas digester. I know it's good to have a biogas digester, but for the farms that they don't have biogas digester, they also use the manure to the farmland. So I don't know how they calculate why you have a biogas digester. Your numbers, like carbon footprint, will be very small. But if you put manure in the field to grow crops, and your carbon footprint get higher. I don't know how they do that. For me, I feel they should be the same, right? Either way, you put it in the field or somehow recycle that.
Yeah. So what they're trying to do, Sean, is they're trying to. So you're right. Even the effluent from the biodigester has to go out in the field. What we're really trying to do is very few people. So if you, again, I'm going to come back to the U.S. model because I don't want to speak to a world model right now. That's too complicated. But in the U.S., just back from California last week, looking at a lot of dairies, and they've got large manure ponds, and they're not covered. So all of those manure ponds are producing, once you get below, 6 to 8 inches, maybe 10 inches, if you're not aerating it continuously, you become anaerobic. They're producing methane, right? Yeah. And so we have lots of that in the US. That is what they're this is what we want to offset here. So that is a direct loss. You're going to lose carbon. You're not going to lose a lot of nitrogen, although there will be some ammonia volatilization. But eventually that comes out and it does go to the field. So it is being recycled. But as that's happening, you still incur some, you've got nitrous oxide losses, you've got some more ammonia loss. And I'll just make, the quick comment there. And I think I made it during the webinar, for every 10 grams of methane, 1 gram of nitrous oxide is going to offset that. All right, so we have to be really careful on the nitrogen side, but the methane digesters or the compressed natural gas processes are really designed to make sure that manure isn't excreting a bunch of methane into the atmosphere, and that we're actually doing something functional with it, right, to capture it. So I understand your point, but at the same time, it seems intuitive that either way shouldn't be a big deal, but that methane loss out of the manure pit or manure storage is actually a bit of a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, last one, I just make a comment about emotional level. I talk on emotional level. You mentioned that quite a few times. That one actually extremely important. Recently, I'm doing some trainings to my sales team. I learned a lot about the emotion and logic. They say logic make you think, but it's really emotion make you act. So if we talk, as scientists, as a technical people, and we get used to think logically and show them, well, here's models, here's 1, 2, 3, then you get 4, 5, 6. But actually, people quite often they learn, they listen your logic, but they just make them think, they don't act. What really trigger them to act is emotion level. So we in your presentation, you mentioned quite a few times I think that's extremely important, and how we like PhDs, we are scientists, how we talk to the consumers on emotional level and make them realize dairy is really good for us. I don't know, but that's really extremely important.
Yes. Yes. Logic does not encourage people to act. not unless you're really an academic and the data will encourage you, but no, that's not how we're going to move most of society.
Well, and then it just makes you mad if you're an academic when people don't pay attention to facts. But anyway, moving on to Sean, if you're set, I'm going to move to Marcos, because I bet that the Argentines are chafing at the bit to ask more questions. So Marcos, after you speak, I'm going to go back to Paula.
Okay, thank you, Marian.
Thank you for joining us, Marcos.
Okay, thanks you, Paula and Mike. Thanks a lot for the talk. I just have a question. I think I found it interesting to this metrics of measuring nitrogen efficiency by dividing the nitrogen in milk by the nitrogen in urine. Could you develop a little bit on that? Like, for example, we can measure milk urea nitrogen easily in farms, but we can get these metrics using the model. So what would be good numbers and how what could you develop a little bit more on that? Okay, I think it's very interesting, I think.
Yeah, I have more comfort in using the urinary nitrogen predictions and knowing what milk yield is, but you could use milk urea nitrogen. Again, the problem is it's not specific, and you're not always sure. So you'd have to again balance that out by rumen available nitrogen versus just overfeeding protein on an MP or amino acid basis. So some work was done, and I can pull it up and send it to Marianne, who can distribute it to everybody. Some work was done, conducted at University of Wisconsin, not at Madison. It's one of the research units. Might have been Michelle Watteau. And what they did is they correlated, to your question, they correlated milk urea nitrogen with urinary nitrogen excretion, and have reasonable predictions. And so you could use that, right? I think the problem is that, you're measuring, almost everyone measures milk urea nitrogen on a bulk tank. How do you modify the diet for a bulk tank? Right. And I think this is where the difficulty comes in making a real adjustment, because you don't know if a lot of your MUNs are coming from your high cows or your low cows or the mid lactation cows. And depending upon the size of the herd, they may be in different states of nitrogen status and may have more or less MUNs, which means more or less milk or urinary nitrogen excretion, but you're never going to know from a bulk tank. So I can get you that data. I'm happy to share that with you. I find that a less precise way to make adjustments to the diet, because I just don't know what the distribution is within the dairy. How's that?
And what about using that ratio, the nitrogen in milk divided by the nitrogen in urine? Like you said something about using a 1-to-1 ratio.
Yeah, no,
I found that interesting. Like maybe useful, like metrics for formulation.
No, they're highly collinear. Right. What you have to understand is milk urea nitrogen is going to be collinear with urinary nitrogen. So that actually doesn't give you a good metric, which is why we use productive N to urinary N, because what we're trying to account for is nitrogen for milk protein synthesis, nitrogen for maintenance, and then nitrogen that's used for either fetal development or tissue replenishment. Then that versus that against the urea, the urinary nitrogen excretion. Milk urea nitrogen is, I understand what you're trying to do there, but the correlation between milk urea nitrogen and urinary nitrogen is very, very high. And in matter of fact, they're collinear, and in the way that you wouldn't actually be able to make any adjustments that made sense.
I was thinking about that graph. Can you move, Marianne?
Is it the slide 13?
Yeah.
This one. I think
Okay.
you see have much more variation in nitrogen in urine than you have in nitrogen in milk.
Exactly.
So it seems to be a reasonable approach, like the very high ratios.
But remember, no, that's a great question. But remember that in this particular description, the cows are energy is first limiting, right? So the milk urea nitrogen, the milk, it says, and that blue line is not milk urea nitrogen, it's milk, all milk protein. So it's the casein, the whey, and the urea.
Yes, total nitrogen.
Right, total nitrogen.
Yep.
Under conditions where they should be first, where protein's not first limiting, but energy is. So there should be no real shift in that output. The moment you start making those adjustments, now you're going a couple different directions. Which is why, given the large variability in the urinary nitrogen, it makes it easier just to fix it to productive N.
Okay, that's okay. No, that's fine. Go ahead, Marianne. Go to Paula.
Okay, thank you, Marcos.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
Sure.
So Michel Watteau spoke a few years ago, and it was so long ago, I don't precisely remember what he spoke. But yes, Mike, if you share that information, I can put it up in our resources as a PDF and have a link on your webpage to it on your for the recording of this. Let's see, Paula. I think we are back to you. Are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready. Yes.
Okay.
So I have two questions about grazing in dairies. The first one is from Gonzalo. If the diet is balanced, could we say more forage means more methane and carbon dioxide? And the one from Ivan is, why is pasture a negative factor when talking about greenhouse gas emissions?
Great questions, Paula. So let's go back to the first one. Let's do the first one first. So re-ask the question, just because I got both questions and now they're confused in my head.
Okay. The one from Gonzalo is, if the diet is balanced, could we say more forage means more methane and carbon dioxide?
Yeah, okay. I know where you're going on that. I think it depends on the quality of the forage. In pasture grass tends to be much less mature than most of the temperate grasses that we feed here. Now we'll harvest, again, back to North America, we'll harvest our corn silage at maturity. And then we do that worldwide, right? So you've got a very mature plant. There's a lot of cross-linking. You're going to make a lot of methane from that. On the pasture grass, if it's high quality pasture grass, my high quality pasture grass is, I think, about Irish pasture grass, 1,500 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, right? And that's their metric. That's their best grazing density. That pasture grass is 30 to 33, maybe 35% NDF, with a ruminal digestibility of 80% and a total tract digestibility of about 88, right? So very high digestible NDF. But the most interesting thing about this, and it's funny that you asked the question, because we were actually doing an exercise today where we're trying to come up with equations to predict methane, looking at some of these differences. And you would say that a pasture is 100% forage diet. But what you find in methane predictions is that it doesn't behave like 100% forage diet as if it was coming from corn stover or a more mature grass. And the reason for that is because there's so much NDF soluble material, right? So in these pasture grasses, if they're high quality, high digestible, we're 30 to 33% NDF, but we're 22 to 25% sugar. And the correlation between methane production and sugar is negative. And we've got a reasonable amount of protein, right? We're 18 to 20%. And we can go on, right? There's very little starch, about 1 to 2%. But if you look at the cross-linking of the hemicellulose with lignin, it's very low. If you look at the hemicellulose to cellulose ratio, it's very interesting compared to a mature forage. The reason I bring that up is we see low correlations between methane production and hemicellulose, but very high correlations between methane production and cellulose. You can separate that out, which is what we're working to do. So when you have a forage that has a higher percentage of hemicellulose, you actually see slightly lower methane production. So the pasture grasses, yes, we're going to feed more forage, but if it's high digestibility and high quality, the amount of methane per unit of NDF looks like it's actually a little bit lower, right? And the turnover rate's faster. So in methane, you know, is done to dispose of hydrogen. So if the rumen's moving faster and turnover is quicker, then I think that also reduces, because there's so much water volume coming in with every bite of dry matter, the turnover is faster, so the methane production tends to be a little bit lower. So I don't know if that helps, but we're seeing, even with 100% forage diet by category, it doesn't fit. The predictions just don't fit a high forage diet from a more temperate system. So I don't know, but maybe that answers the first question. What's the second question?
Yes, I think that was a very extended answer. Thank you very much for that. The second question is, why is pasture a negative factor when talking about greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't say that to be funny. I'm laughing because I think this is one of our struggles right now in the industry. Because if you think about overall carbon balance, the best way to improve our overall carbon balance is to use more of the resources that's produced on our farm footprint and recycle them in our farm footprint. And your question's really good, and it's one that I'm struggling with. I'm laughing because I usually do that when I'm frustrated. Because I'm trying to get people to think about the accounting system. And so I agree that why is it negative, right? It should be a positive. And why should it be a positive? Well, in the case of the pasture, that's all photosynthetic carbon, right? Those plants sequestered the CO2 from the atmosphere. They converted it into plant carbon, cellulose, hemicellulose, all sorts of other things. They gave off some oxygen. The cow consumed it, and then she's going to give it back off as, you know, CO2 and methane. The problem that we run into there, but it's photosynthetic carbon, not fossil fuel carbon, so it's recycled carbon. In the IPCC documents, The CO2 given off by the cow is considered neutral because that's going to be taken up by the plant, right? And it's a complete cycle, right? So we don't penalize the cow for that. What they're penalizing the cow for is the methane. And my argument is, so if you listen to Frank Mitloner, Frank's going to talk about, the GWP asterisk and the 10-year life and the turnover and things like that. That's still way too complicated to me. For me, it's very simple. That methane came from photosynthetic carbon. It will eventually end up again being recycled as CO2. Yes, it has a higher global warming potential, but it's not new carbon, right? And I think the problem that we face right now is some of that, there's where the problem becomes more difficult, is the carbon source and the carbon balance that we have in the atmosphere. Cows take the hit for that because that methane has such a high global warming potential compared to the CO2. But the bigger issue is that we're counting fossil fuel CO2 as not dangerous, right? Not as dangerous as the methane, yet the fossil fuel CO2 is new, right? And that part of the accounting is not being differentiated yet. And so the cow takes the hit, right? And that's why a pasture dairy or any dairy, right, is being scrutinized more than it should be, because we're not looking at it fully as a photosynthetic carbon source, but it's not being differentiated as well as it should be from fossil fuel. I think that's really the crux of it in the end, right? It's not that they want to damn a dairy or they want to say this is bad. Nobody knows how to do the accounting, or nobody wants to think through the accounting principles effectively.
Paula, do you have more?
I have one more.
Okay.
This is about, this is from Leandro. Do you have experience using gelatinized starch and bypass proteins in terms of the better rumen function?
Yeah. So anything, yep. So anything we can do to enhance starch digestion in the rumen is going to be a positive. The gelatinized starch is really interesting as a product, but you got to be careful with it. So here's one of the problems. The gelatinized starch will digest. You've basically linearized starch, you've removed all the hydrogen bonding, you've removed all the zane protein protection. So it's pretty much, 98% available to the bacteria. It has water holding capacity like I've never seen before. You can take and put 10 grams in the bottom of a glass and add some water and it will swell up 7 times its size, if it's truly gelatinized the right way. It digests like sugar, right? The rate of digestion that we have on that product is around 42 to 45% per hour. So in basically in just over 2 hours, it's whatever that initial meal was, it's pretty much completely gone. It's very sticky, so it doesn't pass out of the rumen. The key to it, and I hear all of these discussions about, well, I can feed that and then just feed some escape protein source and I'm good. I will tell you that in the herds that have tried that, at least some, I don't know all the herds, right? I can't keep up with everything, but I know that when that came out, we had a bunch of herds in the US jump on it and they did crash a bunch of cows, right? So in how they crashed the cows was the rate of digestion on that starch is very, very high. The extent of digestion on that starch is very, very high. The nitrogen demand to feed the bacteria who are going to digest that starch is very high. So one of the things that we had, and we actually ran an in-house study where we were feeding the cows, graded levels of that gelatinized starch, and the cows weren't behaving correctly. And I had a postdoc here who kept saying, hey, the milk is not behaving properly, the intakes are not behaving properly, the feces is not behaving properly, what's wrong? And he had MUNs, right? This comes back to the MUNs, and the MUNs looked normal, right? They were running about 8. So he says, our MUNs are good. I kept telling him, no, the nitrogen balance in the rumen cannot be good. He said, no, the MUNs are good. So I said, you've got cannulated cows, pull the cannula plug out, take some rumen fluid, do an ammonia measurement, right? We can measure ammonia with a couple probes. He measured the ammonia in the rumen fluid. It was 0. No, couldn't measure any ammonia in rumen fluid. Right. So the digestion was so high and there were so many bacteria being formed that they used up all the rumen available nitrogen. The recycling couldn't keep up. When since we were doing a dose titration on that gelatinized starch, we were feeding about 1 kilo, 2 kilos, and 4 kilos. Right. And this is on the 4 kilo, right? That's a lot. I understand that's a lot. But we didn't know anything about the product, and we didn't know how it would behave. To get that 4 kilo feeding system under control, we had to feed over 200 grams of urea to get the nitrogen balance of the rumen up to something that looked close to adequate, like 5.5 milligrams per deciliter. In fact, I think we were at about 250 to 300 grams of urea by the time we finished doing all the titration. Once we did that, we had tremendous responses, right? But what we learned is you probably don't want to feed that much of it. A couple kilos is more than enough. In a pasture situation or something like that, very little, because it digests like sugar. But I see it as a useful feed. I will just tell you to be cautious and make sure you have enough rumen available nitrogen to meet the demand for all of that fermentation, because it's like a product that we've never seen before. It's like a pasture grass that's all sugar.
Mike,
yep.
Your answer was very, very interesting, but I'm sorry, but I missed one part of the question.
Okay.
No, I mean, it was about rumen function, but considering the production of methane and the carbon dioxide also.
Oh, yeah. Well, anything. So with all that starch or with that kind of sugar, there's going to be a negative effect on methane, right? CO2 is going to be high, but we should not worry about CO2. Nobody worries about CO2 coming out of a cow. They only worry about it is methane and CO2 equivalents. So methane should be our entire focus. Don't worry about CO2, worry about methane. Anytime you put more starch, more fermentable sugar in the diet, you're going to suppress, or not suppress, but just you're going to use more of the hydrogen, because you're going to build more propionate. That's going to use a couple hydrogens, so you don't have to put it onto a methane. You're going to offset it that way. So your stoichiometry works by getting more starch into the diet to a point. There.
Perfect.
Shorter answer.
Very, very clear. Thank you very much.
Okay. Paula, any more questions?
No. Thank you.
Okay. So Mike, I have a question from Weeben, and this is just sort of to re-emphasize, is urinary urea concentration more sensitive indicator of dietary nitrogen utilization than MUN?
So is that urinary urea?
Yes.
Yeah, I given everything that I know and how I think about this, I think MUNs are good if you're measuring individual cows or strings of cows, like high cows versus fresh cows, things like that. So you can actually have a metric specific to that group, their intakes, their metabolism, their milk output. If you're looking at a bulk tank, it's incredibly insensitive because you've just pooled all the cows into one number. And I don't know how to make adjustments to that. So to me, it's much easier. I can take the predictions from the CNCPS on urinary nitrogen excretion, which I have a lot of comfort with, as long as you've described the chemistry, the intakes, and the cows, right? You do have to have your characterizations, pretty well done. That's going to be much more powerful than a bulk tank MUN.
Tom
Okay.
has an opinion.
No, I've got a question. I've got a question on urinary nitrogen then. Wouldn't it be pretty important to have, isn't urinary nitrogen going to follow a very similar diurnal pattern as PUNs?
No, because, well, yes, it will, but we're not measuring it. We're predicting it over a 24-hour period.
I'm going back to Weebs though. If he was, thinking about measuring urinary nitrogens, it would get really tricky. I would think on ensuring that that all the samples were collected at the same time of the day to avoid that diurnal variation.
Absolutely. And the problem is I'm reviewing a paper like that right now where they did spot samples and they're trying to put it all back together and they're using creatinine as a marker. And it's very obvious they don't have enough, in some cows, they got too much nitrogen, and other cows, they don't have enough nitrogen. It just didn't work. So yeah, I don't see that as a useful way to get that done. And even if we're doing, just so everybody, if you've never done a total collection on cows, when you do, if you look at the sum of the studies that are published on that topic, the standard deviation on total nitrogen collection are amongst all the data are plus or minus 20%. And that's on total collection in research settings. So it's a very, very imprecise way to get at nitrogen efficiency.
Well, even from a practical standpoint, thinking back to some of the work that, oh God, who the hell was it that was in Ag-Eng when we were doing the Cayuga farm study with Bill Cook and Fezidans. Was it? I can't remember his name.
Dan? You're talking about Dan?
Wasn't his first name Rick? Who did?
Oh yeah. The engineer.
Yeah, the engineer who did the urine sampling and measured the ammonia, the volatilization from when she urinated until it hit the floor and then went into manure storage. Just her peeing and hitting the floor, there was 10% of the ammonia that volatilized pretty damn quick. So that whole sample handling, so trying to do urinary collecting and using urinary nitrogen as an index of where the herd is fraught with potential errors and sensitivity issues that would make it an impractical tool to implement on farm.
Yep, exactly. Which is why I just stick to the predictions.
Yep.
Okay. Unless we get some other questions or comments, I think that we have exhausted them at this point. Mike, thank you. And thank you everybody that stayed and everybody that attended. Obviously, this will be one of our marathon webinars. And we'll get all this up probably next week. I'm not sure. I'm not positive I'm going to do any processing tomorrow. So,
well, let me finish by saying, for everyone that celebrates Easter, have a happy Easter this weekend, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next month.
yes.
Yep. Happy Easter.
All right. Happy Easter, everybody.
Thank you,
And
guys. Okay.
thank you. Yep. And to
Thanks, Sam.
remind everybody, we'll have office hours next time too. So thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and everybody have a good night.
Okay, good night. Bye.
Good night.
Okay,
Good
bye-bye.
night. You can go to bed, Hudai.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.
Good night. Bye bye.